Welcome to Chapter 12 of Deep Horror Stories to Sleep With. This time, we dive into a tale that reminds us that the most terrifying things aren't lurking under our beds or hiding in the dark. They're the people we pass every day, the ones who can walk through the world unnoticed until it's too late. If you're ready to face your fears, don't forget to subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the most chilling corners of human nature. Now, let's begin. The rain began just as Hannah pulled into the driveway, fat drops pelting the windshield and turning the world beyond into a blur of grays. She sighed, letting the engine idle for a moment as she mentally prepared herself to face another evening alone. Her husband, Nate, was away on one of his endless work trips. The house felt enormous and empty without him, the kind of quiet that seemed to magnify every sound. Hannah loved the house during the day, with its sprawling backyard and large windows, but at night, it took on a different character, darker, more oppressive. Grabbing her bag, she dashed from the car to the front door, fumbling with the keys as rain dripped from her hair onto the polished wood of the porch. Inside, the familiar scent of cedar and her lavender candle greeted her. She flipped the lock behind her, double-checked it, then reset the security system. It was a ritual she'd fallen into lately, one she didn't mention to Nate. He always teased her for being jumpy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't quite right. Hannah kicked off her shoes, padded into the kitchen, and set about making tea. The rain drummed against the windows, and the hum of the kettle filled the air, a soothing distraction. She was just reaching for a mug when she heard it, a faint creak from the upstairs hallway. She froze, mug in hand. It was probably nothing, the house settling, or maybe she'd left a window open earlier. But the sound came again, louder this time, as though someone had taken a slow, deliberate step. "Hello?" she called out, her voice betraying her unease. Silence. Hannah grabbed the heavy flashlight from the counter and headed toward the stairs, her grip tight and clammy. With each step, the creak of the wooden boards beneath her feet seemed to echo louder, as though announcing her presence. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing. She checked the bedrooms, the closets, even the guest bathroom. Everything was in its place. Yet the uneasy feeling lingered, a weight pressing against her chest. She returned downstairs, scolding herself for being paranoid. But as she settled onto the couch, she noticed something out of place. Her phone, which she was certain she had left charging on the kitchen counter, now sat on the coffee table. She stared at it, the tea forgotten in her hands. Slowly, she reached for the phone, her mind racing for an explanation. Maybe she had brought it over without thinking. Maybe she was imagining things. As her fingers brushed the screen, a notification buzzed to life. A photo. Her breath caught as she opened it. The image was dark, grainy, but unmistakable. A picture of her sitting on the couch, taken from somewhere behind her. The hair on her arms stood on end. She spun around, her eyes darting to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. The rain outside had intensified, drowning out any subtle sounds within the house. She typed a frantic message to Nate, her hands shaking. Someone's in the house. Her thumb hovered over the send button, but then she stopped. A soft click came from the back door. Hannah didn't move. Her heart thundered in her chest as her eyes fixed on the shadowy outline of the back hallway. The rain outside beat a frantic rhythm against the glass, masking any subtle noises. She strained her ears, trying to separate the storm from the faint creaks of the house. The click had been unmistakable, though metal against metal, the distinct sound of the lock turning. She rose slowly, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But where? Outside into the storm? To the neighbors? 100 yards away through the downpour? Hannah tiptoed toward the kitchen, her breath shallow and quick. The open layout of the house now felt like a threat, leaving her exposed to unseen eyes. Her socks slid slightly on the polished floor as she reached the corner and peeked toward the back door. It was closed, locked. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the flashlight. Had she imagined it? The earlier photo on her phone was proof enough that something was off. But now she began to doubt herself. Her thoughts were interrupted by another sound, this one closer. A soft shuffle, like someone shifting their weight. She turned sharply, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark kitchen. Empty. Then, a faint sound behind her, breathing. Hannah spun again, but there was nothing there. The room was still. Her breathing quickened, the sound harsh in her own ears. She backed up against the counter, her hand searching blindly for her phone. It wasn't there. Her stomach dropped. She had left it on the couch after seeing the photo. Slowly, she forced herself to move toward the living room, every step feeling heavier than the last. The dim glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the walls, turning ordinary furniture into looming shapes. The phone wasn't on the couch. Instead, it lay on the floor, just out of reach of the lamp's glow. She crouched down, her trembling hand extending to grab it, and then she saw it, the faintest reflection in the black screen of her phone. Movement behind her. Hannah dropped the flashlight, the clatter loud in the silence. She whipped around, her eyes wide, scanning the room. Empty, but the reflection had been real. Hannah's pulse hammered in her ears as she stayed crouched, clutching her phone. The shadows around her seemed to shift and stretch, her fear giving life to the darkness. The rain outside was relentless, smothering any distant sound, isolating her further. She forced herself to take a deep breath, her fingers fumbling as she unlocked the phone to call 911. As the dial tone buzzed, a muffled thud came from upstairs. Her thumb froze over the call button. She stared at the ceiling, her breath hitching. Another sound followed, a soft drag, like something heavy being moved across the floor. The phone vibrated in her hand, the screen flashing. Call failed. No, 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 she whispered, the words barely audible as her shaking hands tried to redial. The same error message blinked on the screen. The storm must have knocked out the signal. Another thud from above sent a jolt through her. She glanced toward the stairs, their darkened ascent looming like an invitation she didn't want to accept. Every nerve screamed at her to leave, but her legs felt like lead. Her gaze darted toward the front door. If she could make it to the porch, she could run to a neighbor's house. She clutched the flashlight and moved toward the door as quietly as she could, her socks muffling her steps. Then she froze. The front door lock turned with a deliberate click. Hannah backed up instinctively, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The knob twisted, slow and deliberate, but the door didn't open. Her stomach churned as she realized whoever was there wasn't trying to break in. They were waiting for her to come closer. Panic clawed at her throat. She spun toward the back door, considering her options, but a soft tap-tap-tap against the glass panes stopped her cold. Someone was at the back door too. Her flashlight beam wavered as she shined it toward the source of the noise. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the view, but the outline of a hand pressed against the window was unmistakable. A sharp knock followed, jolting her back to reality. She bolted. Racing to the stairs, she bounded up 2 steps at a time, her breath ragged and loud in the suffocating silence. She stumbled at the top, catching herself against the banister, and sprinted toward the master bedroom. Once inside, she slammed the door and locked it, her chest heaving. She grabbed the dresser and pushed it in front of the door, the scrape of wood against the floor almost deafening. The house had gone eerily quiet again. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, but beneath it, she could make out faint footsteps, multiple pairs, moving deliberately through the house. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A new text message flashed on the screen. "Come out, Hannah." Her breath caught. She didn't recognize the number. Her hands shook as she typed back, "Who are you?" 3 dots appeared, indicating a reply. Her heart pounded as she waited, staring at the screen. "We're already inside." Hannah bit back a scream, clutching the phone to her chest as she backed away from the door. Her eyes darted toward the windows. 2nd floor. No escape. The footsteps grew louder, now on the stairs. A low murmur of voices followed, too quiet to make out but unmistakably human. She grabbed the only weapon she could find, a heavy lamp, and gripped it tightly, positioning herself near the closet. If they got through the door, she'd have one chance. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom. A soft knock came, followed by a man's voice, calm and almost polite. "Hannah, we don't want to hurt you. Open the door." She stayed silent, her knuckles white around the lamp's base. The voice spoke again, this time with an edge. "We can see you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The doorknob jiggled, then stopped. Seconds passed like hours, the silence pressing in on her. Then the sound of wood splintering filled the room as the door buckled under a heavy kick. The door frame gave way with a deafening crack, the dresser screeching as it scraped against the floor. Hannah's breathing quickened, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She crouched in the corner by the closet, gripping the lamp like a lifeline. The light from the hallway spilled into the room as the door swung inward, revealing 2 silhouettes. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like predators enjoying the chase. "Hannah," the man's voice called again, casual yet chilling. "You're making this so much worse for yourself. We just want to talk." The taller of the 2 men stepped into the room. His boots crunched against the debris on the floor. He carried something long and heavy, a crowbar. The other man followed, his face partially obscured by a hood, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Hannah pressed herself tighter against the wall, her sweaty fingers slipping on the smooth surface of the lamp's base. The taller man turned his head toward the closet. "You think she's hiding in there?" "Probably," the other replied, his tone laced with amusement. Hannah's lungs burned as she fought the urge to gasp for air. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The taller man grabbed the closet door handle and yanked it open with a flourish. "Empty." "Not here," he said, feigning disappointment. The other man turned his head, his gaze scanning the room. His eyes landed on the corner where Hannah crouched. A slow smile spread across his face. "There she is." Hannah's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She surged forward, swinging the lamp with all her strength. The heavy base connected with the taller man's arm, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor. "Ah, you little—" he roared, clutching his arm. The other man lunged at her, but she ducked and bolted past him, her bare feet skidding on the polished wood floor. She didn't dare look back as she raced down the hallway. Behind her, she heard the heavier man bark, "Get her!" She threw herself down the staircase, her grip on the railing barely keeping her upright. Her mind raced. The front door? No, they'd locked it. The back door? The tapping earlier meant someone might still be there. She veered toward the kitchen, her eyes darting to the block of knives on the counter. The sound of pounding footsteps behind her sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She yanked a knife from the block just as the smaller man reached her, his hand grazing her shoulder. She spun, slashing wildly. He stumbled back, a gash appearing on his forearm. His shocked expression gave her a split second to act. Hannah darted past him, heading toward the laundry room. It had a small window, barely big enough to fit through, but it was her only option. She threw open the window and shoved her body through, ignoring the sharp edges that scraped against her sides. As she tumbled into the rain-soaked yard, she heard the taller man shout, "Don't let her get away!" The cold mud squelched under her feet as she scrambled to her knees, her knife still clutched tightly. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was her only chance. She sprinted toward the trees, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The rain blinded her, and every step felt like a struggle, but she didn't stop. Behind her, the men gave chase. Their voices grew louder, closer, their threats cutting through the storm like blades. Hannah's legs burned. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, but she didn't dare stop. The trees were dense, their shadows swallowing the faint light of the moon. Branches clawed at her face and arms as she pushed deeper into the woods. Behind her, the men crashed through the underbrush, their shouts and footsteps a relentless drumbeat. "You can't run forever, Hannah," one of them bellowed, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Hannah's grip tightened on the knife. Her mind raced with possibilities, her fear giving way to a steely determination. She knew these woods better than they did. It was her only advantage. Ahead, she spotted a small ravine, its steep edges slick with mud. Without hesitation, she slid down, the mud caking her hands and clothes. She crouched at the bottom, her breathing shallow as she listened. The men reached the edge moments later. "Where'd she go?" the smaller one asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "She's close," the taller man growled. "Fan out. We'll find her." Their footsteps separated, one heading left, the other right. Hannah pressed herself against the muddy bank, her heartbeat thunderous in her ears. She waited until their footsteps grew faint before climbing out of the ravine, every movement slow and deliberate. As she crept through the trees, she caught sight of the smaller man. He was just a few feet away, scanning the shadows. His back was to her, her fingers clenched around the knife. She didn't want to do this. She'd never hurt anyone before, but they had left her no choice. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the wet ground. In one swift motion, she lunged, plunging the blade into his side. He let out a strangled cry, his body crumpling to the ground. Hannah yanked the knife free, her hands trembling. She didn't have time to think. The other man's voice called out, closer now. "Ryan, you good?" Hannah grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and pressed herself against a tree, waiting. The taller man appeared moments later, his flashlight cutting through the rain. When he saw his companion lying motionless, he froze. "Ryan?" Hannah didn't give him time to react. She swung the branch with all her strength, the impact sending him sprawling. He groaned, his crowbar slipping from his grasp. Before he could recover, she pounced, slamming the branch down again and again until he stopped moving. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps as she stumbled back, the rain washing away the blood and mud from her trembling hands. For a long moment, she stood there, staring at the two lifeless bodies. Then she turned and began walking, her knife still clutched tightly. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing. She had survived, and she would never be a victim again.
The night fell heavy on St. Agatha's Hospital, draped in a veil of fog that seemed to curl and twist like something alive. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the corridors appear twisted, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Nurse Eleanor Langford walked down the hallway, the thin heels of her shoes clicking in time with the steady beat of her heart. This was her shift, the one that began when the world turned cold and silent, where most souls found comfort in sleep. But not here. The wards were never truly empty. The faint hum of machines and distant murmurs were the only sounds that filled the void. Yet tonight, there was a wrongness to it, a tightness in the air that made her throat close up. Eleanor had worked at St. Agatha's for years, long enough to know the routine, the odd hours, and the haunting stories whispered among the staff. Tales of unexplained movements, shadows slipping past corners, and patients who spoke of figures in the night, figures with eyes that glistened like wet stones. She had scoffed at those stories once, but now, with each passing hour, the stories felt less like rumors and more like warnings. She passed room 311, its door ajar, the faint crack of light seeping out, casting narrow slivers across the floor. A low moan echoed inside, distant but unmistakable. Eleanor hesitated, breath caught in her chest. It was a sound she had come to know well, the pained, almost pleading voice of Mr. Whitaker. The man had been a patient for over a month now, suffering from a condition no doctor dared name. His pale, cracked lips whispered secrets too horrifying to share, and every night he would beg to be let out, to be freed from something that gripped him tighter than any disease. A soft shiver ran down Eleanor's spine as she reached out to push the door open. The air grew colder, brushing against her skin like an unseen hand. Inside, Mr. Whitaker lay twisted on the bed, his emaciated body shivering beneath the thin hospital sheets. His eyes, hollow and wide, fixed on her with an unnatural intensity. "I told you not to come," he rasped, the sound brittle as dry leaves. Eleanor stepped in, her fingers tightening around the handle of her clipboard as she forced herself to meet his gaze. The room smelled of antiseptic, but something else mingled in, a scent like rotting meat, sour and sickly. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Mr. Whitaker, it's time for your medication," she said, the tremor in her voice betraying her. "No," he whispered, and the rasp of his voice seemed to echo, almost like a chorus. "Not tonight. Not tonight." The overhead lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a moment that felt like an eternity. When they blinked back to life, something had changed. The room seemed to lean forward, its walls pressing in, breathing with a life of their own. But it was not the room that had shifted, it was the space behind Mr. Whitaker. He turned his head slowly, a grotesque sound like cracking bone following the motion. His eyes rolled back, revealing a dark cavity where no white should have been. And there, in the corner, a shape emerged, a thing not of flesh, but of shadow, with limbs that were too long and twisted at angles that defied reason. Eleanor's heart stopped. The sight was impossible, as though the fabric of reality had been torn, and through it, something ancient and unknowable seeped into her world. "I warned you," Mr. Whitaker's voice deepened, no longer his own, but that of something else. "We all warned you." The floor creaked under her feet as she stumbled backward. Her pulse drummed against her ribs, and she was aware of her own trembling hands. The creature stepped forward, its movements liquid and unnatural, and as it did, the air thickened with a sound like rasping, scraping metal. Eleanor reached for her radio, but the static that burst forth was not the comforting buzz she expected. It was a voice, deep and guttural, whispering in a language that made her head spin and the blood freeze in her veins. Eleanor's hand trembled as she gripped the radio, the static hissing like a chorus of serpents. The voice behind it was sharp, dissonant, and ancient, sending a jolt of fear straight through her chest. She dropped it in her panic, the device clattering to the floor and releasing a spray of sparks that danced like fireflies in the dim light. The creature advanced, its limbs folding and twisting in ways that should have been impossible. Its torso was thin, almost skeletal, but wrapped in layers of shadow that shifted and pulsed, revealing glimpses of something like sinew and bone beneath. Eleanor's mind screamed at her to flee, but her legs felt as though they were cast in concrete, rooted to the floor by a force far stronger than her own terror. The hallway outside seemed to echo her dread, but the sounds that seeped in were not the usual hum of machinery or distant footsteps. Instead, they were guttural, wet sounds, the thud of something large and heavy dragging itself toward her. "Don't," Mr. Whitaker said, a voice torn between his own rasp and the deeper, sinister undertone that had emerged from his mouth. His eyes, once filled with confusion and pleading, now glistened with the kind of knowledge that made the mind crack. It knows. The creature's face, if it could be called that, was an ever-shifting blur of darkness, dotted with eyes that blinked and wept black tears. One of them locked with Eleanor's, and in that instant, she felt the world shift. Her thoughts splintered, and a cold, ancient voice whispered within her mind, an invitation to madness. "You will join us," it said, a promise that tasted of rot and decay. Her pulse quickened as the room darkened further, the walls now pressing in like the fingers of a malevolent hand. The air was rank with a tang of something metallic, and her vision blurred with a surreal, crimson haze. Eleanor could feel the thin membrane between sanity and insanity straining, as if it were about to snap. "No," she whispered, but the sound was drowned out by the echoing shriek of the creature. It lunged forward, its limbs slithering across the floor, and Eleanor stumbled backward, her vision spinning. A sudden thud rattled the room as a figure appeared in the doorway. A figure in a lab coat, face obscured by the shadows but moving with a sure, deliberate stride. It was Dr. Monroe, the night supervisor who had been an enigma since the day Eleanor first walked into St. Agatha's. His eyes, dark and hollow, met hers, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something else. "Get out," he rasped, though his voice was not entirely his own. Before she could move, the creature's sinewy arm shot out, knocking her to the ground. The cold bite of the linoleum floor burned against her cheek as the creature loomed over her, its form more solid now, a mixture of shadow and grotesque flesh. The foul stench was suffocating, and Eleanor could taste the sourness on her tongue as she tried to scream, but her voice was choked off by terror. Dr. Monroe moved forward, but he was no longer himself. His eyes, wide and glazed, held the dark, unknowable depth of a mind broken by something far worse than death. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a guttural growl escaped him, and from the depths of his throat came a shadow that reached out to Eleanor, tendrils writhing like hungry serpents. Eleanor's vision dimmed as her head spun, and the shadow coiled around her, cold and seeping into her very bones. The creature's eyes met hers again, and in that moment, she felt the boundaries of her sanity dissolve, replaced by a terror so profound, it became a part of her. The creature's whisper pierced her consciousness, each word like a shard of ice in her soul. "You cannot run from what you are." The world around Eleanor seemed to tilt, the walls of room 311 warping and folding in on themselves as though they were made of paper. The shadow that had erupted from Dr. Monroe's throat slithered over her, its edges writhing like hungry worms. It reached for her neck, tightening around it with a cold, constricting force. Her vision tunneled, and she clawed at the air, fighting for breath as her hands scraped against the icy, slick surface of the creature. Through the growing haze, she heard Mr. Whitaker's voice again, softer now, almost gentle. "It's too late," he said, but it was the voice of someone who had already surrendered, a voice that spoke of acceptance and despair. "We're already part of it." The shadow pulsed, taking on a darker, deeper hue. In its depths, Eleanor could see glimpses of things that were not meant to be seen, eyes like black holes, mouths agape in silent agony, limbs twisted in grotesque, unholy contortions. They reached out for her, calling her name in a cacophony of whispers that made her ears ring. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest, a deafening thrum that threatened to crush her ribcage. She kicked and screamed, but the shadow held her fast, drawing her deeper into its grasp. The room seemed to fold in on itself with each beat, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly, as if struggling to stay alive in the growing dark. The stench of rot and decay was suffocating, but now there was something else, a deep, sickly sweetness that made her stomach turn. It was the smell of something old, something that had been buried and left to fester in the damp earth for centuries. And yet, it was alive, moving with a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat. Dr. Monroe's body stood rigid, eyes blank and unmoving, as though he were being controlled from within. A thin line of black liquid dripped from his mouth, pooling at his feet and spreading outward in concentric circles. The shadow that had spilled from him seemed to resonate with that liquid, drawing strength from it as if it were a lifeblood. The voice in Eleanor's mind grew louder, gnawing at her consciousness with words that defied human understanding. They were ancient, echoing in a language lost to time, filled with a weight that pressed against her sanity like a vice. She could feel the chill of it seeping through her veins, turning her blood to ice, making her limbs feel like lead. "I'm not ready," she whispered, the words slipping through her lips like a prayer, an invocation of denial. "Not ready?" came a voice from somewhere near, but it wasn't Mr. Whitaker. It was a sound like the screech of metal on metal, and when Eleanor turned her head, she saw the shadow twisting into a face, an amalgamation of every human expression twisted in agony and fear. The eyes were black and deep, and in them, she saw herself, caught and trapped like an insect in amber. "You were never meant to be," the voice rasped, and it was as if the creature had spoken the truth of all existence, a revelation that cracked her mind wide open. The walls groaned, the floor shivered, and she felt herself being pulled forward, pulled into that impossible living mass. The shadow was everywhere now, draped across the floor and climbing up her legs, cold and clammy. She was being swallowed by it, devoured by its strange, hungry embrace. The fingers that clawed at her were not her own, but something else, reaching, grasping, trying to pull her into the depths. The heartbeat in her chest slowed to a heavy, sluggish beat, as if it too was being devoured by the darkness. Eleanor gasped for breath, but no air came. Her vision blurred, the last thing she saw being the glistening, black eyes of the creature and the broken, pleading face of Mr. Whitaker. Eleanor's vision grew dim, the edges of her sight darkening into a thick, impenetrable shadow. Her body, once capable of movement and defiance, now felt as though it had been carved from stone, cold and lifeless. The pulse of the creature thrummed around her, a grotesque symphony that echoed the beating of her own heart, a heartbeat that was now erratic, desperate. The room had become a cavern of endless night, where time ceased to exist and the weight of silence pressed down with the force of a mountain. A low, guttural hiss erupted from the shadow, reverberating through her very bones. It was the sound of an ancient thing, something that had slumbered beneath the earth for eons, waiting for a crack to open and let it loose. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, an iron grip of terror squeezing her from the inside out. She felt her sanity unraveling, thread by thread, as the creature's presence invaded every inch of her mind, every crevice of her soul. From within the writhing mass, a single tendril broke free, slick with black bile, and reached for her face. It was thin, sinuous, and impossibly fast, coiling around her jaw and pulling her toward the source of that unearthly, droning hum. Eleanor's scream echoed, thin and brittle, against the walls of the suffocating darkness. The smell of rot intensified, mingling with the putrid sweetness that clawed at her senses. She felt a choking wave of nausea rising in her throat. "Help me," she rasped, but the plea fell silent as the room grew colder, if that were possible. The temperature plummeted, and a sudden frost curled around the edges of the walls and floor, a creeping ice that sapped the last warmth from the air. The shadow quivered, its surface now a mirror that reflected a fractured version of her own terrified eyes. The tendril pulled tighter, and she felt the bite of its grasp on her skin, leaving imprints like bruises in its wake. The drumming in her ears grew louder, merging with the frantic pounding of her heart, a chorus of dread that drowned out all other thought. Her skin felt clammy, prickled with cold sweat, and she trembled as the shadow moved closer, revealing hints of other, darker shapes within it. Faces, mouths agape in agony, fingers reaching out, pleading for release. She glanced at Mr. Whitaker, whose eyes were wide, pupils dilated with the horror of recognition. The black fluid that dripped from his mouth pooled around his feet, spreading like a living thing. It crept toward her, dragging the scent of decay and ruin, and she realized, with a sickening jolt, that the floor beneath her had begun to crack and splinter, splitting open to reveal a void that pulsed with a rhythmic, pulsing light, something that moved and shifted, just beneath the surface, like a second heartbeat. "No, no, no," Eleanor whispered, her voice a broken chant that did nothing to soothe the panic clawing at her throat. Her limbs were frozen, her vision clouded, but she could still feel the presence of the creature pressing against her mind, each tendril a lifeline to a maddening, unknowable consciousness. The walls shuddered as if in pain, the ceiling above cracking, and from those fissures, more tendrils spilled out, reaching and pulling, dragging her into the living, thrashing darkness. The floor beneath her crumbled, and she felt herself slipping, falling, drawn by the whisper of darkness and the ceaseless pulse that had become the measure of her existence. The tendrils tightened their grip, and for a moment, all was still, an awful, suffocating silence that stretched and pressed, waiting. Then, the creature's face appeared in front of her, an abomination of shifting shadows and twisted flesh. Eyes within eyes, mouths within mouths, each revealing a landscape of pain, despair, and ancient, unspeakable knowledge. Its voice slithered into her mind, seeping through her defenses and shattering whatever semblance of composure she had left. "Join us," it whispered, and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend with the weight of its command. The cold seeped deeper, and Eleanor felt the final threads of her mind snap, leaving only the raw, unfiltered essence of her terror. Eleanor's mind splintered, the last vestiges of her sanity breaking apart like dry glass. The shadow that had surrounded her now coalesced into a single, monstrous form. A grotesque figure made of darkness and memory, its limbs writhing with unnatural speed, its head tilting in a gesture of terrible curiosity. The room shrieked as if the walls themselves were in agony, the fluorescent lights shattering, and the cold intensified to an unbearable point, pricking her skin like 1,000 needles. The tendrils constricted around her, pulling tighter, cutting off her breath. She struggled, her muscles quivering as though each nerve was aflame. The creature's eyes, black voids of depthless malice, were fixed on her. It pulled her close, the sound of her heartbeat now a deafening roar in her ears. For a moment, the world was reduced to that single, suffocating gaze. "You have no choice," the creature murmured, its voice slicing through her mind, cold and implacable. The black liquid pooled beneath her, spreading like ink across the floor. It reached out, touching her shoes, crawling up her legs, seeking her warmth, her life. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to reverberate off the walls, but it was met with silence, an oppressive, eternal silence that consumed the hospital room. The shadows around her began to twist, seething with anticipation, and in their center, the figure split apart like a wound opening, revealing a yawning, gaping maw of countless jagged teeth. Eleanor's vision blurred as a burning sensation swept through her, and she realized, with horror, that the black liquid had reached her skin, seeping into her pores. It wasn't cold, it was fire, a hellish, consuming fire that spread from her legs to her chest, making her scream again, this time in a raw, untamed agony that left her shaking. The creature's mouth opened wider, and the whisper of its voice, a serpentine hiss, reached her ears once more. Death is but the beginning. Suddenly, the world buckled beneath her feet. The ground cracked and split, the darkness bleeding through the crevices. Eleanor's vision cleared for a brief, horrifying moment, and she saw Dr. Monroe standing at the edge of the abyss, his eyes now a blazing white that burned with an unnatural light. The shadow within him pulsed, sending ripples across the ground that seemed to reach for her, drawing her in. "Let go," he whispered, his voice broken as though the words had been torn from him. His expression twisted in what could have been guilt or sorrow. "You have to let go." Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the bile that rose in her throat. "No," she gasped, shuddering as the burning liquid consumed her chest, its searing tendrils inching toward her neck. She clawed at the air, her fingers brushing against the cold, sterile tiles, looking for something, anything, that might save her. But the tendrils were insatiable, more determined than any force she had ever known. The creature let out a roar, a sound that split the silence with a force that made her bones tremble. The air was now filled with the screech of metal, the roar of flames, and the desperate beat of her heart. The creature's maw opened wide, revealing a hollow that seemed to twist the fabric of space itself, a gate to an unspeakable void where light dared not venture. And then it began to pull. Eleanor's body was yanked forward, past the threshold of the room and into the yawning darkness, the walls shattering around her like glass under pressure. The scream that tore from her throat was not just a cry of terror, it was a sound of pure, primal dread, echoing in the empty corridors as the light around her blinked out, leaving only the sound of the creature's laughter, deep and unending. Her mind, torn between consciousness and oblivion, flailed as she was pulled into the depths of that darkness. The last thing she saw was the haunted face of Mr. Whitaker, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something else, something she couldn't name. And then, as the tendrils wrapped around her and the world grew colder, the abyss took her, swallowing her whole, leaving nothing but the echo of her scream. The darkness closed in around Eleanor, an oppressive wave that crushed her body and twisted her soul. The tendrils, slick with the black, bile-like substance, coiled around her limbs with a relentlessness that defied reason. The room dissolved into nothingness, replaced by the yawning void where she now found herself, a place devoid of light or sound, save for the whisper of 1,000 agonized voices. The creature loomed behind her, its grotesque, shifting form blotting out what little was left of her vision. Eleanor's screams, raw and strangled, gave way to desperate sobs as the reality of her fate sank in. The black liquid had spread through her veins, crawling with an insidious hunger that turned her blood to fire. She convulsed, the muscles in her arms and legs spasming uncontrollably, locking her in place. Pain roared through her, a deep, insufferable torment that tore at her very core, unraveling her flesh from the inside out. The creature's maw, now a chasm of jagged teeth and glistening, pulsing tendrils, opened wider, emitting a sound that was both a roar and a mournful sigh. From the darkness, a sharp, metallic sting surged through her chest as one of its tendrils plunged deep into her, breaking skin, muscle, and bone. The force of it ripped into her ribs with a sickening crack that echoed in her ears. Eleanor's vision darkened, a shiver of cold spreading from her heart to her limbs. As the creature's tendrils dug deeper, her skin split open, dark ichor seeping from the wound and mixing with the blackness that encased her. The tendrils pulled and twisted, warping her body in unnatural ways, contorting her muscles as if they were pliable wax. A guttural sound rose from her throat, half a scream, half a choking gasp, as her ribs fractured under the pressure. Her chest expanded and collapsed, a gruesome parody of breathing, as blood leaked from the corner of her mouth. Her hands, trembling with the last vestiges of will, reached up to the wound in her chest, fingers slipping through the dark, viscous fluid. The pain was all-consuming, every nerve in her body screaming for release that would never come. The creature's laughter resonated, a deep, resonant sound that made the walls of the darkness shudder. The final seconds blurred together, filled with agony and the deafening chorus of her failing heart. Her vision tunneled, the edges blackening as the darkness whispered its victory. The last thing she saw before the pain consumed her entirely was the face of Dr. Monroe, his eyes wide, filled with both regret and terror. But before she could scream for him one final time, the tendrils coiled tighter, cracking her ribcage in a sickening crunch, and she felt the wet, hot spill of her own insides being forced out of her, running down her chest in a rivulet of death. And then, nothing. The room fell silent, the echoes of her last breath swallowed by the darkness, and the creature, now sated, began to retreat into the shadows, leaving only the stain of her suffering behind, a reminder that death in the presence of such malevolence was never kind, only brutal, raw, and grotesque. Ethan had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the tires on the asphalt beginning to lull him into a dazed state. He should have stopped for a rest hours ago, but something kept him pushing forward, an urgency he couldn't shake, like something was pulling him toward the empty stretch of road ahead. The headlights of his car sliced through the thick dark, casting long shadows across the shoulder. He hadn't seen another vehicle in miles, and the isolation only amplified the creeping sense of unease that had begun to settle in his gut. It was late, later than he'd intended, but the fatigue was beginning to take over, and his thoughts felt foggy. His phone, nearly dead, rested on the passenger seat. The silence of the car, the only sound being the low hum of the engine, began to press down on him, making the atmosphere feel heavier, suffocating even. The trees along the road, dark and shadowed, blurred past him. It had been a long day, longer than expected, and his body was starting to ache from the tension. He turned the dial to the radio, hoping for some kind of distraction, but all that filled the car was static. His eyes flickered toward the passenger seat, where his coat lay crumpled. He frowned, feeling a strange discomfort. Nothing was out of place, but the seat felt too still, too quiet. He glanced at the rearview mirror, the interior of the car bathed in dim, ghostly light, and for a moment, it almost seemed like someone was sitting behind him. But when he blinked and looked again, the back seat was empty. He shook his head, trying to shake off the strange thought. Maybe he was just tired. Still, his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, and his eyes kept drifting back to the empty passenger seat. He told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks. He was alone, of course. He was always alone when he drove through these stretches of road at night. But something about the stillness, the lack of any sound outside of the car, made it feel off. A rustling sound came from the seat beside him. Ethan's pulse quickened. He stiffened, eyes darting quickly to the side. His heart skipped a beat as his gaze swept over the empty space. His jacket. Just his jacket. But the sensation that something was different lingered in the air. His breath hitched slightly as he refocused on the road ahead, trying to tell himself it was nothing. It was just the car shifting, or maybe the wind playing tricks on him. He reached for the steering wheel again, tightening his grip. Then a faint noise. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, almost like the sound of fabric brushing against fabric, a soft rustle coming from the passenger side. Ethan's heart skipped. His eyes shot toward the passenger seat again, but it was empty. He could feel his muscles tense, his breath shallow. It was nothing, but then it happened again. A creak. Not from the road. Not from the engine. It was something inside the car. From the seat beside him. A sound like a body shifting. His pulse raced, his fingers now gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His gaze flicked back to the empty seat, his mind starting to race. He forced himself to look ahead, focusing on the road. Just keep driving. Get to the next town, he thought. But the sensation didn't leave him. It was as though something or someone was there, just out of view, waiting. He tried to shake it off, his hands trembling as he adjusted the mirror. Nothing. Just the road. Just the endless stretch of dark highway behind him. Then, from the corner of his eye, a shadow. A slight movement. His heart lurched. He couldn't bring himself to look, not at first. His eyes flicked back to the passenger side, but the seat was still empty. His mind, however, wouldn't let go of the feeling. His gaze turned to the rearview mirror, then to the side mirror, and finally back to the passenger seat. A tap. Soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a shiver down his spine. Ethan sucked in a breath, his eyes widening as he quickly checked the locks on the door. They were still secure, still locked. But the tapping continued, gentle, rhythmic, an unsettling pattern of little knocks against the window. He didn't dare look. The feeling of being watched, of being observed, pressed on him like a weight. He could feel his chest tighten, his breathing quicken. He tried to convince himself that it was just the wind, or maybe the rustling of the jacket next to him. But the tapping wouldn't stop. It was persistent, slow, deliberate. His fingers tightened around the wheel, and his foot instinctively pressed the accelerator harder. The car picked up speed, but the tapping didn't slow down. It was still there, still soft but growing louder in his ears. Just stop. Just stop and check. There's nothing there, he muttered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. He glanced at the passenger's seat one more time, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. But the seat was just as empty as before. The tapping stopped suddenly, and for a moment, all he could hear was the hum of the engine. Everything's fine. It's fine, he thought, though his mind wasn't so sure. But as he stared at the road ahead, the shadow of someone, seemed to appear in his peripheral vision. He wasn't sure if it was just the darkness, or if it was his mind playing tricks on him. Either way, his body was starting to feel like it was made of ice. A sudden jolt startled him as something shifted beside him, the sound so sharp it felt like it came from within the car itself. A low, breathy noise filled the air. It sounded like a sigh, soft and slow, just beside him. Ethan's body stiffened, and he turned his head towards the passenger seat, almost unwilling to look. His breath was shallow now, heart hammering against his ribcage. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to confirm what he was already beginning to fear. And then, a whisper, so faint he thought he imagined it. "You know I'm here." His stomach dropped. He glanced to his right, unable to stop himself this time. There, in the dim light from the dashboard, he saw something shift. A shape, an outline. The seatbelt moved, and the seat seemed to sag, as if someone were pressing into it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His hands were frozen on the wheel. The car swerved slightly as his eyes flicked back to the road. It was then that he saw something in the corner of the rearview mirror. The faintest flicker, like a shadow passing across the seat behind him. Stop. It was almost too quiet to hear, but it was unmistakable. He could feel the sweat collecting at the back of his neck now. He didn't dare look again. His hands were slick on the wheel, but still, he couldn't take his eyes off the road. His mind screamed at him to stop, to pull over, to get out of the car and run. But what if it was too late? Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened as his eyes remained fixed on the road, though his mind was spiraling. His heart thudded in his chest like a drumbeat, loud and heavy. Every inch of his body screamed for him to stop the car, to get out and make sure no one was there, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. What if it was nothing? What if he was just imagining everything? And yet, the unease didn't leave. It hovered like a dark cloud, suffocating him. His breath came faster now, shallow, as the road stretched on endlessly before him. The quiet tapping had returned, though this time, it was more insistent, louder, like the sound of fingertips drumming against the glass. It came from his side, the passenger window, so close to him that it felt as if it were right next to his ear. The noise seemed to echo in the confined space of the car, amplifying his anxiety. His eyes flicked toward the window. He couldn't help it. Something inside him urged him to look, even though every instinct told him not to. The tapping continued, deliberate, rhythmic, until it stopped suddenly. And then, nothing. Silence. For a split second, the car seemed to breathe, the tension hanging thick in the air. Ethan's mind raced. It's all in your head. Just get to the next town, get to the lights. There's nothing here. But before he could calm himself, a soft rustling came from the back seat. The unmistakable sound of fabric shifting. Ethan's body went rigid. His head snapped to the rearview mirror again, his reflection pale under the harsh light, eyes wide with panic. His heart pounded louder now, drowning out everything else. He could hear it, the softest of breaths, the faintest sound of someone exhaling from the back seat. Ethan's stomach lurched as his gaze darted toward the rear window. He didn't dare look directly at the back seat. The reflection in the mirror was all he could bear, and it was all too much. Please, let it be nothing. Just a trick of the light. Please. But then, the quiet voice returned, this time much closer, too close. It seemed to come from right behind him. Don't look. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. His body screamed to move, to act, but his mind was paralyzed. He couldn't tell where the voice came from, but he could feel it in his bones, the coldness of it creeping under his skin. His palms were slick with sweat now, the steering wheel almost slipping from his grasp. His hands shook as he tried to force himself to focus on the road, but the tapping, the breathing, the voice, all of it was becoming too much. His thoughts were unraveling, the paranoia creeping in like a poison. It was then that his headlights swept across something ahead of him, something moving in the distance just off the side of the road. His pulse shot up as he instinctively swerved the wheel, narrowly avoiding the figure. The car veered, tires screeching, and for a split second he thought the car might flip. His heart raced as he struggled to regain control, his breath coming in sharp, erratic gasps. When the car finally straightened, he slammed his foot down on the brake, bringing it to a halt. His chest heaved as he frantically glanced around. There was no one outside. Nothing. The road was empty, silent. But the weight in the air, the feeling of eyes on him, didn't go away. His hands still gripped the wheel, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back. He slowly exhaled, his pulse still hammering in his ears. He glanced at the passenger seat again, just to confirm that it was empty, that nothing was there. But the coat, his jacket, the one he'd tossed in the seat earlier, was now resting in a different position, slightly askew. A chill crawled up his spine as he realized that, even though no one had gotten in, the seat seemed to sag more than it had before. Like someone had just leaned into it. A sudden knock, sharp and quick, came from the rear window. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't even need to look to know that the sound had come from inside the car, from behind him. The breath caught in his throat as he finally turned his head, staring into the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, nothing visible in the mirror. The back seat was still empty, the shadowed space as desolate as it had been when he first checked. But that feeling was there again, pressing on him. The thick weight of it. Suddenly, the car door handle beside him jiggled. It wasn't a gentle pull, but a desperate, frantic yank, as though something, or someone, on the other side was trying to get in. The handle rattled violently, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook uncontrollably, his mind splintering into panic. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know where the sound was coming from. All he could hear was the rattling and his own labored breathing as the world around him narrowed into that single, harrowing moment. The jiggling stopped, and for a split second, everything was quiet again. Almost too quiet. The only sound left was the hum of the engine, running steady and loud in his ears. Then, a voice, a soft whisper, came from just behind him, too close. "I'm already here, Ethan." His body froze. It felt like his heart had stopped. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And then, the unmistakable sound of a slow, deliberate exhale brushed his ear. Whoever it was, they were in the car. Ethan's eyes went wide, his pulse thundering in his ears. His mind scrambled, struggling to process the impossible situation he was in. That voice. His voice, or at least something mimicking it, felt like it was right behind him, hot breath seeping into his ear like a slow, suffocating fog. The air in the car seemed to thicken. The scent of sweat, his own panic, mingled with something metallic, like blood. His hands trembled uncontrollably on the steering wheel, and his vision blurred. The world around him shrank to just the inside of the car. Nothing beyond the windows mattered. The road, the trees, the distant lights of the town, it was all secondary to what was happening here now. That voice again, a whisper that barely stirred the air, sent shivers down his spine. "Don't move." A sick feeling churned in his stomach as his fingers hovered over the gear shift, his instincts screaming at him to drive, to get away from whatever this was. But his body betrayed him. His foot felt glued to the brake. The car sat still in the darkness. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time, he didn't look away immediately. He needed to see something, anything that might explain what was going on. There, in the reflection, something stirred. His heart stopped. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, just the reflection of his own eyes looking back at him in fear. But then the shadow shifted again, something moving, something darker than the rest of the car. It wasn't in the seat, it wasn't against the glass, it was behind him. The presence had moved, and it was closer. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed for him to act, but his limbs felt leaden, like he was paralyzed. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mouth open as if he were about to scream, but no sound came out. Another slow exhale from behind him, so close that the hairs on his neck stood up. The voice, this time, no longer a whisper, breathed directly into his ear, low and gravelly. "We can keep doing this all night. But we both know you'll never get out." Terror flooded his body in waves. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, like there was something pressing down on it, suffocating him. He wanted to look, to confront whatever was there, but his mind kept screaming at him not to. "Don't turn around." A moment of pure, raw fear passed, and then Ethan's body jerked. The door handle rattled again, louder this time, a violent shake that shook the frame of the car. The car door was opening. Someone was getting in. He wasn't imagining it. The metallic screech of the door handle twisting was unmistakable. He could feel it in his bones. He tried to move, tried to slam his foot on the gas, but his body betrayed him again. His vision began to narrow. Everything outside the car was a blur, but in the mirror, something was moving, inching closer. A dark figure. A person. Ethan snapped his gaze back to the window beside him, pressing his body hard against the seat. His breath came in shallow gasps. No, no, no. He was trapped. A low, guttural laugh echoed from behind him, sending chills through his spine. "You should have never gotten in, Ethan." The words were slow, mocking, each one dripping with malice. And then, the unmistakable sound of a heavy, deliberate footstep on the floor of the car. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his hands sweating and slipping from the steering wheel. He wasn't alone. The figure was in the car with him, and he still hadn't seen them. He couldn't. It felt like the very air inside the vehicle was being sucked away, as if someone was pulling every bit of energy from him, from his body, leaving him gasping, helpless. What do I do? His mind raced as he glanced at the glove compartment, at the window controls, at anything he could use to escape. There was no way out. There was no escape. "Don't worry," the voice continued, smooth and cruel. "I'll make sure you don't have to face this alone." Suddenly, Ethan's heart lurched, and his stomach twisted violently. The voice, that voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was all around him, inside his head, twisting his thoughts. The words didn't even make sense. He felt like his thoughts were being drowned out by the pressure of it all. He glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. This time, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. There, in the reflection just behind him, was a face. It wasn't anything recognizable, not fully, but it was a face, pale, with wide, almost too wide eyes, a thin mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It seemed to watch him, its gaze unwavering, studying him like an insect under a magnifying glass. The face smiled. And then, before Ethan could even process what was happening, the car jerked forward, as if someone had slammed their foot on the gas pedal. He screamed, his body slamming against the seat as the car lurched into motion, careening down the road at breakneck speed. The engine roared to life, its sound deafening in the confined space. The wheels screeched as they tore across the asphalt, but there was no control. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel in a desperate attempt to regain control, but it was useless. He could barely keep his eyes open against the dizzying speed. And all the while, that presence remained, close enough that Ethan could feel the chill of its breath on his neck. Ethan's eyes darted from the windshield to the rearview mirror, desperately trying to catch any glimpse of what was behind him. The road stretched endlessly before him, but it was like he was trapped in a loop, the world outside a blur of lights and shadow. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, but the car refused to respond. It felt like something was controlling it now, pulling it further down this nightmarish path. The laughter came again, louder now, filling the space inside the car. It was low and cruel, reverberating like it was coming from all directions at once. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop the car, to put the brakes on and run. But he couldn't. His body wouldn't obey. As the laughter subsided, the voice returned, almost calm now, as if the person behind him had all the time in the world. "You're not going anywhere, Ethan," it said, each word dripping with venom. His head snapped forward again, his mind racing, trying to think, trying to find any way out. The road was empty, the surrounding woods dark and oppressive, as if they were swallowing the light from the car's headlights. There was nowhere to stop, no place to escape. He was alone in the vast expanse, just him and whatever was hiding in the back seat. It's not real. It can't be real. His thoughts fractured under the pressure. It was impossible. He had to be imagining this. But the sensation of something, someone, there, it was undeniable. It was too real. The car sped faster, as if being pushed by some invisible force. The sound of the engine reverberated in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps, his heartbeat erratic. The windows were fogging up now, the air inside thick and suffocating. He wiped at the glass with his sleeve, trying to see, trying to focus, but it was like everything was becoming warped, a swirling mess of sound and confusion. The car seemed to be losing its shape, its boundaries blurring in his mind. He couldn't make sense of anything. Suddenly, a sharp sound sliced through the air, the crunch of metal on metal. The car jolted violently, as if something had slammed against the rear bumper. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively slammed his foot on the brake, the tires screeching in protest. The car fishtailed, swerving dangerously to the left, but somehow, he managed to regain control just before it hit the guardrail. His breath caught in his throat as the headlights cut through the mist, revealing something in the road up ahead. A figure. A man, standing in the middle of the road, motionless. The car lurched forward again, as if driven by an unseen hand, speeding toward the figure. Ethan's pulse spiked, his entire body tense, but he couldn't stop it. His foot was frozen to the gas pedal. The figure didn't move. It stood still, watching him, waiting. Ethan felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck, and his stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to turn the wheel, to drive off into the ditch if he had to, but the car refused to obey. The figure was getting closer, closer, closer. Just as they were about to collide, the figure vanished. The car passed through the spot where it had been standing, but there was nothing there anymore. Only the road. Empty. Silent. Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind scrambling to understand what had just happened. But before he could process it, he heard a soft, sickening thud from behind him, like something, or someone, had just shifted in the back seat. His eyes flew to the rearview mirror again, and this time he saw it. A pale hand reaching forward from the darkness behind him, its long fingers scraping the back of his seat. The scream that tore through his throat was lost in the deafening roar of the engine. His foot finally obeyed, slamming the brake pedal to the floor. The car screeched to a halt, tires smoking against the asphalt as it came to a violent stop. The night was deafeningly silent now. Ethan sat there, trembling uncontrollably, his chest heaving as he stared at the rearview mirror, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to move. To show him what was really happening. The back seat was empty. Still silent. But the smell. The air in the car was thick with something metallic, something rotten. It stung his nose, clung to his skin. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, movement, flickering in the shadows of the back seat. Ethan's eyes locked on the reflection in the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, the figure revealed itself. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't just a man. It was a face, twisted, distorted, eyes wide and unblinking, a mouth stretched into a grin that looked too unnatural to be real. And it was right behind him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure leaned closer, Its hollow eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The grin on the man's face was wide and sickening, showing teeth that were yellowed and crooked, as if he hadn't smiled in years, if ever. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. His heart hammered in his chest, thudding so loudly it drowned out everything else. His fingers gripped the steering wheel with a pain he couldn't feel, too terrified to even move. The man's face was just inches from his now, close enough that Ethan could smell his breath, sour, like rotten meat, a stench that made his stomach churn. "You're not going anywhere," the man rasped, his voice low and cold, each word like a death sentence. The figure's hand shot forward, and for the first time, Ethan's body moved, jerking forward in sheer instinct. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, but the car barely responded. It was like the engine was losing its power, struggling under the weight of the tension that filled the air. His chest tightened, and his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror once more, terrified of seeing what was creeping behind him. But there was no need. The man's hand was already on him, grabbing his neck with a force that took the breath right from his lungs. It wasn't cold like a ghost's touch. It was burning hot, the grip of a human hand, strong and unforgiving. Ethan fought to pull away, but the man's fingers only tightened. The car veered off the road, tires screeching against the gravel, but the steering wheel felt useless under his hands. The figure's voice, still too calm, still too close, whispered in his ear. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Ethan's mind was spinning. Who was this man? What did he want? His heart raced, but his mind could barely keep up. The only thing he knew for certain was that he had to get away. He had to stop this. The road ahead was pitch black, the headlights flashing over dark shapes in the distance. A turn, a sharp curve, and then the car slammed into something. Trees? A guardrail? Ethan didn't know. He was thrown against the wheel, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs. But he could still feel the hand on his neck, pulling him back. Dazed, Ethan staggered out of the car, struggling to keep his balance as the world spun around him. His head was pounding, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He looked back at the wrecked car, half expecting the man to be there, staring at him from the shadows, but the figure was gone. Ethan turned and stumbled away from the wreckage, his chest heaving, his mind a blur of panic. His legs felt weak, like they were about to give out beneath him, but he forced himself to move, to run. The woods around him felt like they were closing in, the trees swaying unnaturally in the wind, the darkness pressing in from every side. And then, just as his foot struck the ground again, he heard it, a soft crunch, the sound of something moving in the brush behind him. No. His heart lurched, and he twisted around, eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. Just the forest. Empty. Silent. But then the voice came again, low, almost too calm. "You really thought you could outrun me?" Ethan froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice from the car. The same man. He was still there. Still following him. The realization hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a ghost. It wasn't something supernatural. This was real. The man had been in the car the whole time, just biding his time. And now he was hunting him. Ethan's pulse spiked, and adrenaline surged through his body. He needed to run. He needed to get away, but where? The woods were endless. The night was silent. He couldn't hear anything but his own breathing. With a gasp, he pushed himself into a sprint, forcing his legs to move, but his body felt heavy, slow, like it was being dragged back into the darkness. He could hear the crunch of footsteps behind him, close, too close. It was only when the ground beneath him gave way, when he fell into the mud and gravel, that he realized the truth. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't getting away. The night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and your nerves buzz. Rachel had just finished putting her 2-year-old daughter, Lily, to bed, tucked her in with the comforter, and kissed her forehead goodnight. The soft glow of the nightlight cast shadows across the room, painting the walls with a muted yellow haze. It was the perfect end to a peaceful evening, the kind Rachel cherished after a long day of work. She headed downstairs to the living room, curling up on the couch with a cup of tea. The windows were open, allowing the cool night air to sweep through the house. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a moment to herself like this. No emails, no work calls, just the quiet hum of her own thoughts. Then, the sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, a creak from upstairs. Rachel froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her chest. It wasn't unusual for the old house to make noises. The floorboards had always been temperamental. But this was different. The sound was too deliberate. Footstep. Rachel held her breath, straining to listen, but everything was still. The night returned to its eerie silence. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the old house was just settling. She took another sip of her tea, trying to shake the creeping unease, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Then, another creak. Louder this time. Her pulse quickened. It couldn't be Lily. Her daughter was a heavy sleeper. And besides, the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy. Rachel's eyes darted to the front door. Of course, it was locked. But was it? She had always made sure to double-check before bed. A sudden shiver ran down her spine. She set the tea down, quietly rising from the couch, her feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. The house was old, a creaky 2-story Victorian with rooms that felt like they whispered to each other when no one was around. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching her. Rachel moved toward the staircase, her steps slow, cautious. The creaks continued, each one sending a ripple of dread through her. They weren't random, they were measured, as if someone was carefully testing each step before putting their full weight on it. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, and Rachel strained her ears, trying to catch the slightest sound. The only noise now was her heartbeat in her ears. "Lily," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that you?" No response. Just silence. Rachel took a slow step forward, her breath shallow, her hand trembling as it gripped the railing. The house felt different now, the air heavy with an unseen presence. She reached the top of the stairs and turned to face the dark hallway. The room at the end of the hall was her daughter's room, but something about it felt wrong. The door was cracked open, but the light inside was dim. Another creak. This time, right behind her. Rachel spun around, her eyes darting into the darkness. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The hairs on her neck stood on end, and every instinct screamed at her to leave, to grab Lily and run. But she couldn't. Not yet. She stepped toward Lily's room, her mind racing with possibilities. Could it be an intruder? She'd heard of break-ins happening in the area, but she never thought it would happen to her. Never thought she'd be the one to face something like this. Another step. And then a voice. It came from the shadows, so soft and cold, it sent a chill straight to her bones. "You shouldn't have come up here." It was low, deep, almost like a whisper, but there was no mistaking the malice in it. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, she felt something more than fear. She felt the icy grip of terror, something that clawed at her insides, gnawing away at her resolve. She had to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She stood frozen, heart hammering, as the sound of footsteps grew closer. Then the door to Lily's room creaked open, and the faintest outline of a figure appeared in the doorway. She was no longer alone. The figure in the doorway was tall, obscured by the dim light from the nightlight in Lily's room. The shadow loomed like a twisted silhouette, too still, too deliberate. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her mind screaming at her to run, to flee, but her legs refused to move. Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaky, as if speaking the words would make the figure real, solidify the terror that was threatening to swallow her whole. No answer came. The figure didn't step forward, nor did it retreat. It just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, each beat deafening in the silence that stretched between them. She forced herself to take a small, tentative step forward, her feet as heavy as lead. "Lily?" Her voice cracked as she spoke her daughter's name. There was no answer, only the quiet hum of the nightlight in the next room. But there was a coldness in the air now, a chill that crept beneath her skin and settled in her bones. Another step. Her fingers brushed the doorframe, and she almost recoiled from the icy sensation that surged through her hand. She didn't dare look inside Lily's room. Not yet. Her gaze remained locked on the figure, the vague shape in the shadows. It was tall, almost unnaturally so. Its outline was blurred, like a smear in the air, but Rachel could make out the outline of a man, narrow, yet bulky, as if the clothes he wore didn't fit him properly. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, but Rachel couldn't quite place it. Then the figure moved. It wasn't a sudden movement, but rather a slow, calculated shift, as if the person was stepping into the light on purpose. And as they did, Rachel's breath hitched in her throat, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. The face was a mask of shadows, but there was enough light now to see the twisted features, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes that gleamed with a dark, sick amusement. The lips curled into something close to a smile, but it was a smile that didn't belong to a human being. "Rachel," the figure spoke, the voice low and rasping. It was familiar, too familiar. Her heart lurched. The name, her name, slipped through the air like a ghost. A chill ran down her spine, colder than the room itself. "Greg?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but the voice, the smell of old leather and cigarette smoke that lingered in the air, was unmistakable. Greg had been her husband, her late husband, the one who had been killed in a car accident 5 months ago. She had buried him, held his funeral, said her goodbyes. But now, standing before her in the dim hallway, was someone, or something, wearing his face. The smile on the figure's face grew wider, more twisted. "You really thought I was gone, didn't you?" Rachel felt her knees buckle, and she staggered back, panic flooding every corner of her body. Her mind was spiraling, the world around her spinning as she tried to comprehend the impossible. "No, no, no, no," she muttered under her breath. Her fingers grasped for the doorframe as her vision blurred, the figure moving closer, each step slow and deliberate. "Don't you remember, Rachel?" The voice was like gravel scraping against stone, grating, almost painful to listen to. It wasn't an accident. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She felt sick. No. This wasn't possible. Greg had died. She had watched him die. It couldn't be him. And yet, the voice, the smell, the presence, all of it was so horribly familiar. "No!" she screamed, backing away as fast as she could, her hands fumbling behind her, reaching for the door to Lily's room. "Get away from me!" The figure stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her, eyes glowing in the dim light. "You can't escape, Rachel. You never could." He was so close now. Too close. The darkness around him seemed to shift, swallowing the space between them, making it impossible for her to breathe. The room was closing in, and the weight of the air pressed down on her chest. "Please no," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her mind was screaming, fighting against the crushing terror. He laughed then. A cold, humorless laugh that echoed in the hallway like a death knell. The sound reverberated in the walls, suffocating her, making her head spin. "Say goodbye to your little girl, Rachel. This time I'll take her too." Rachel's world felt like it was shattering. She backed into Lily's room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door creaked softly as it swung open, But she barely noticed. All she could hear now was the pounding of her heart in her ears, the relentless rasp of the figure's footsteps behind her, and his words, which clung to her like cold hands on her throat. "You can't hide from me, Rachel. You never could." The voice was now a rasp, a slither of something dark that snaked through the air, squeezing every ounce of air from her lungs. Lily's room was dim, but the soft yellow glow of the nightlight filled the space with a faint, sickly warmth. Rachel's pulse quickened as she heard the shuffling outside the door. The man, Greg, was still moving closer, deliberately. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, pressing against her chest. Her eyes darted to the window. The heavy curtains were drawn tight, but the thought of escaping through them made her freeze. The man outside knew what she was thinking. He always had. Rachel could hear him whispering, just on the other side of the door now. His voice was muffled, but it was enough to send an icy shiver down her spine. "You can't protect her," the voice muttered. "Not this time." Her hands trembled as she looked at Lily, still curled up in her bed, fast asleep. She couldn't let him hurt her. Not like this. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move, to think clearly. The gun. She'd hidden it in the nightstand drawer. A relic from when Greg had first started becoming unpredictable, paranoia running through him like a disease. She hated even thinking about it, but now, in the face of this unspeakable nightmare, it was the only thing she could reach for. Rachel moved quietly, trying not to make a sound. She opened the drawer, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of the gun. The weight of it in her hand felt surreal. How had it come to this? How had everything gone so terribly wrong? The door to Lily's room creaked again, and Rachel froze. He was too close. The figure stepped into the doorway, casting a long, twisted shadow across the room. His silhouette seemed to fill the space, blocking out the dim light from the nightlight as if it were nothing. And then, the figure straightened, fully entering the room. Rachel's heart clenched. She didn't know if she could pull the trigger. She wasn't even sure she could survive this. The face before her wasn't the Greg she had once known, the warm, kind man she had married. This was a stranger in his skin. A monster. Someone who had worn him like a suit and was now waiting for her to break. She clutched the gun tighter, pointing it at the figure, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "No one can save you now," the figure said, the words a low hiss. Terror clawed at her chest, but beneath it, something colder, more urgent, began to form. The voice. This wasn't Greg. This couldn't be Greg. His eyes, his expressions, they weren't the same. There was a malevolent joy in his gaze, a hunger that Rachel had never seen before. This was not the man she had loved. "You're not Greg." Her voice was shaky, but it held a note of defiance. "You're not him." The figure's face twisted, the smile widening until it became almost grotesque. He took another slow step toward her, his fingers curling into the air like he was savoring the moment. But Rachel wasn't afraid anymore. She had to believe what she was saying. "Oh, but I am." He took another step, and Rachel's finger twitched on the trigger. Every inch of her screamed to pull it, to end it right now. But something held her back. Something about the voice, the movement, the cruel amusement in his eyes. Her gut twisted. A memory flashed in her mind, Greg's eyes, his hands trembling as he held the gun on that night, the night when everything had started to unravel. She'd known, even then, that something inside him had snapped. And when he died in that car accident, she'd felt that shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would be free. But she wasn't. This thing in front of her wasn't Greg. Not anymore. It had taken his form, but this was something darker, something far more dangerous. It was a predator. Rachel felt the sharp edge of panic return. She had no choice. She had to fight. She had to stop this. She couldn't let it finish what it had come for. With her free hand, she grabbed the nightstand, yanking it open and spilling its contents to the floor: pens, papers, and a small box of matches. Her hand brushed against the cold, hard metal of a lighter. Without thinking, she grabbed it, flicking it open. A spark ignited the flame, casting a brief but sudden light across the room. The figure's face contorted with confusion and rage. "What are you doing?" he growled, taking another step toward her. But Rachel didn't hesitate. She reached for the curtains, yanking them aside, letting the full moonlight spill in through the window. As the light illuminated the room, she saw it clearly, saw him clearly. This wasn't just Greg's doppelganger. This was a man she had seen before. A man from the accident. The other driver. And now he was here. And he wouldn't leave until he had finished what he started. The man's eyes flashed with recognition, but not in the way Rachel had hoped. There was no remorse. No trace of the man she once knew, only the twisted delight of a predator who'd cornered his prey. The room seemed to shrink around them as Rachel held her breath, staring into his eyes, praying the gun in her hand would do more than make him pause. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a cold shiver down her spine. It wasn't the laugh of someone who thought they'd won. It was the laugh of someone who had all the time in the world to make sure they enjoyed every minute of the hunt. "You think that gun is going to save you?" His voice had dropped to a near whisper, a mocking tone that made Rachel's stomach churn. "You've always been so weak, Rachel. So trusting." He took another step, and Rachel's grip on the gun tightened. She backed up slowly, her legs hitting the edge of Lily's bed as she stumbled, her eyes darting to the door. That's what she needed. But every time she looked, she saw nothing but darkness. The hallway beyond was pitch black, the house utterly silent except for the sound of his slow, deliberate footsteps. No help would come in time. "Why did you come back, Greg?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why?" "Because I never left," he said, his words like a cold whisper in the space between them. "I was always here, watching, waiting." A sick realization crept up Rachel's spine. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't even about the life they had built together. This was something darker. The twisted remnants of a man who had never truly been her husband. He had never stopped hunting her, even after his so-called death. She couldn't let him get any closer. Without thinking, Rachel turned, her fingers finding the metal of the nightstand again. She gripped the drawer handle, yanked it open, and reached inside. Her breath caught when her fingers brushed against something familiar, a set of keys. She didn't waste time checking which ones they were. She didn't need to know. She just needed to run. "You're not leaving here, Rachel." The man's voice was sharper now, a tinge of desperation beneath the calm exterior. Rachel lunged for the door, her hand slamming against the doorknob. She turned it, her pulse pounding in her ears. The door creaked open. Freedom. But as she stepped into the hallway, she froze. A faint rustle. A low, sickening sound. Someone else was in the house. The floorboards creaked. She spun around, instinctively clutching the gun tighter. Her eyes widened in horror as a figure stepped into the hallway. Tall, slender, his face hidden beneath a dark hood. She didn't recognize him. But the look in his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, made her blood run cold. The figure reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, catching the faint glint of the hallway light above. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just an intruder. This wasn't just a random stranger. This was part of something bigger. Someone had been in her house all along. A chill spread through her body. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. Greg hadn't been working alone. Looking for something? The man's voice was smooth, calculated, as if the situation were nothing more than an inconvenience to him. Rachel's blood turned to ice. She had no time to think, no time to plan. She had to move. Instinctively, she aimed the gun at him. "Stay back," she demanded, her voice trembling. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he took another slow, deliberate step forward, the knife still dangling loosely in his hand. "You think that gun's going to stop me?" he sneered, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "You're out of your depth, Rachel." Her eyes flicked over to the end of the hallway. She knew there was no way out. No escape. The intruder was closing in on her, the knife gleaming in the dim light, its edge catching the moonlight from the window. And the man behind her, the one who had been her husband, was still there, waiting. But she wasn't going to let him win. In a burst of adrenaline, Rachel lunged at the intruder, throwing herself at him. The gun discharged in a deafening bang, but it wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the wall just above his head, a warning shot. The loud noise disoriented him, and he stumbled back, dropping the knife in the process. Rachel wasted no time. She grabbed the knife and turned, facing the man in the hallway. The air felt thick with tension, each breath she took heavy and filled with dread. She had no idea what they wanted or how many there were, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. "Stay back," Rachel screamed, her voice raw with fear and fury. The man from the hallway grinned, but there was something twisted, almost familiar about his expression. She had seen him before. Her mind raced, searching through the fog of panic. Her eyes widened in sudden recognition. It was someone from Greg's past, someone she had never known about. The pieces started to fall into place. She hadn't just been a target because of Greg. She had been dragged into something far worse than she could have ever imagined. The figure in the hallway stepped forward, slowly, methodically, as if savoring the moment. The air around Rachel felt thick, pressing against her chest like a weight. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the knife, but she held it firmly. This wasn't just a random break-in. This was personal. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. Who were these people? What did they want from her? What had Greg really been involved in? The man's eyes flicked to the side, a silent signal. Rachel caught a flash of movement behind him. Another figure, this one partially obscured by the shadows, creeping towards her from the far end of the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She was surrounded. "Stay calm. Stay calm, Rachel." The words echoed in her mind like a mantra. She had to think. She couldn't let them see her panic. They were predators, but she wasn't going to just roll over and be their victim. The man in the hallway chuckled, his voice a deep rasp that sent a chill down her spine. "You really think you're in control here?" He took another step toward her, and Rachel could hear the subtle scrape of his shoes on the wooden floor, each movement deliberate, slow. He was savoring the fear that was beginning to gnaw at her. She couldn't let him get closer. She had to act. In one swift motion, Rachel lunged forward, the knife aimed at his chest. Her attack was a desperate move, fueled by pure instinct, but it caught him off guard. The man tried to sidestep, but she was quick, and the blade nicked his side. He hissed in pain, stumbling back. "Bitch!" he spat, eyes flashing with rage. But instead of retreating, he lunged forward again, knocking the knife out of her hand. It clattered across the floor, out of reach. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She was unarmed, facing down a man with a knife. She felt the cold press of panic squeezing her lungs, but she refused to let it overtake her. She had to keep moving. Before she could react, the figure behind her lunged at her, grabbing her from behind. His grip was strong, his hands like iron around her waist. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but the man's hold was unyielding. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, trying to break free, but he was pulling her toward the stairs. "No," she cried, her voice desperate. She slammed her elbow back, hitting him in the ribs, but it did nothing. The man grunted but didn't release her. The hallway felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. There was no way out. Rachel's mind raced. Her only hope was to get to the door. If she could make it outside, she could run. Just get to the door. She reached for the wall, using it to propel herself forward. Her feet scraped the floor as she dug her heels into the wood, desperate to break free. The man holding her hissed in frustration, but he didn't let go. A sudden noise echoed through the house, a loud crash followed by a scream. Rachel froze. She didn't recognize the voice, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. "What the hell was that?" the man behind her grunted. He looked toward the sound, distracted for just a moment. That's all Rachel needed. With everything she had, she twisted in his grip, driving her knee into his groin. He let out a choked gasp, loosening his hold just long enough for Rachel to break free. She didn't hesitate. She ran. The stairs creaked under her weight as she rushed up them, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing the man scramble after her, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "Where can I go? Where can I hide?" Her eyes darted frantically. The hallway above was narrow, with only a few rooms. She could hear them coming, growing closer. There was no time. She had to think fast. Her gaze landed on the attic door. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep, but it was the only place she could think of that might offer a moment of cover. She rushed toward it, flinging the door open just as the footsteps neared the top of the stairs. She didn't think twice as she slammed the door behind her, heart racing. The attic was cold. The air smelled of stale wood and forgotten things. Rachel didn't care. She ran to the far corner, her eyes darting around for anything she could use. The attic was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and forgotten remnants of her family's past. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she crouched behind a large stack of old moving boxes, trying to steady herself. The only sound now was her pounding heartbeat and the distant footsteps that had stopped only a few feet below. She waited. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to move, to do something, but she forced herself to stay silent. Every small noise felt like an alarm, alerting the intruders to her position. The tension in the attic was unbearable, and the air seemed thick with dread. The footsteps below resumed. The man was searching, but he hadn't reached the attic yet. Rachel had no idea how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. She heard voices, muted, indistinct, coming from below. The man was talking to someone else, the same voice from the hallway. Her mind reeled as the words pieced together in her head. They were waiting for something, waiting for someone, and Rachel was just trapped. Her finger tightened on the trigger of the gun in her hand. She didn't even realize she had it until now. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the voices grew louder, closer, until they reached the bottom of the attic stairs. She could hear the shift of weight, the sound of footsteps hesitating as if one of the intruders was unsure whether she was still up there. She forced herself to stay still, her muscles aching from the tension, the gun cold against her palm. The voices below her began to argue in hushed tones. One of them was calm, almost reassuring, while the other was frantic, sharp. "I told you she's up there," the frantic voice hissed. "I heard her. I don't care what you heard. We're not going up there unless we know for sure. No one goes in the attic unless we're certain she's alone." Rachel's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. They were debating. They were close, too close. She leaned back slightly, trying to peer through a crack between the boxes. Her mind raced. The attic had no other exits, no windows. She was a sitting duck. But there had to be something, some way to escape. She wouldn't let them take her. Not without a fight. The argument downstairs stopped abruptly, and for a few seconds, the house was silent. The quiet was deafening, filled with the distant creaks of the old wooden structure. Rachel's body trembled with the unbearable tension as she waited for the next move, holding her breath. Then came the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, the attic door. Rachel's eyes widened in panic. She couldn't see who it was, but she could hear the slow, deliberate creak of the hinges. She pressed herself harder into the corner, clutching the gun tighter. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, one by one, slow and methodical. The figure in the hallway loomed, a dark shadow against the dim light that filtered in from the open door. Rachel could feel the presence, the heat of it. The man was close. Too close. Her fingers tightened around the trigger, her knuckles white. She didn't care what happened anymore. She would make sure they didn't get to her. And then, just as the figure reached the top of the stairs, Rachel fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the small attic, a sharp crack that shattered the silence and sent a burst of fear through her veins. The man staggered back with a pained grunt, his hands clutching at his chest, but he didn't fall. He just stood there for a moment, stunned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Rachel's heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. The man's face was just visible in the dim light, his eyes wide in shock. She had hit him, but he wasn't dead. Not yet. He took another step toward her, and Rachel didn't hesitate. She fired again, this time aiming at his leg. The sound of the second shot was even louder, almost overwhelming. The man dropped to his knees, gasping in pain. But he wasn't done. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with fury, and hissed through gritted teeth, "You think this ends with you?" Before Rachel could react, the second intruder burst into the attic, a massive figure that caught her off guard. He was faster than she expected, moving with terrifying speed. The two men were upon her, and in the chaos, she lost control of the gun. It skittered across the floor, out of reach. Her breath hitched in terror as the first man, bleeding and furious, grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. His grip tightened, and Rachel's vision blurred as the pressure in her neck increased. Through the haze of fear and desperation, she heard the distant wail of sirens. The two men froze, momentarily distracted. Their eyes flicked toward the window, and Rachel saw the reflection of flashing lights. It wasn't over. It couldn't be over. The intruder holding her squeezed harder, but his eyes darted nervously toward the stairs. He knew the police were coming. "Get out," the second man hissed. "Now." With a final, vicious shove, the first man released Rachel, sending her crashing to the floor. She gasped for air, coughing, her fingers clawing at the floor to steady herself. She couldn't focus, her vision was swimming. But she didn't have time to think. They were leaving. Rachel pushed herself to her feet, stumbling toward the door, her limbs shaking. She could hear the men's hurried footsteps as they retreated down the stairs. She had no strength left, no energy to fight, but the sirens were growing louder. They were almost here, and as Rachel made her way out of the attic, she glanced back toward the darkness, the shadowy figures slipping away into the night. She had survived. Barely. But she knew the terror wasn't over. Not yet. This was just the beginning.
There was a stretch of highway just outside the small town of Holcomb, cutting through an endless expanse of barren fields and skeletal trees. It was a forgotten place, avoided by locals who spoke of strange sounds and movements seen from the corners of their eyes when passing through at night. Yet, it was the only route available to Amber as she drove home after a late shift at the diner. Her car hummed steadily as she squinted at the faded lines on the asphalt, illuminated weakly by her aging headlights. The clock on the dashboard read 1:13 de la madrugada. Holcomb was behind her now, swallowed by the horizon, and the next town was still miles away. She turned up the radio to chase away the creeping silence. Static. She flipped stations. More static. A hint of a melody surfaced, scratchy and distant, before dissolving into the white noise again. With a sigh Amber's shut it off, leaving only the sound of tears against asphalt. The road seemed endless, looping in an unchanging pattern of cracked pavement and dead scenery. Her eyelids felt heavy. She rolled down the window, letting in the frigid air. It beat at her skin, waking her out of focus. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach twisted. There was movement behind her. At first she thought it was the distortion of the cracked glass or the trick of fatigue. But the longer she looked, the more it became undeniable. Shadows darted along the sides of the road, impassably fast, moving in ways that didn't match any animals she knew. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, air took in her chest. Her rational mind whispered excuses, overactive imagination, wild dogs, branches swaying in the wind. Yet, none of those explanations felt right. The steps didn't move with the randomness of animals or the gentle rhythm of nature. They moved with intent. Amber pressed harder on the gas pedal. The car responded with a groan, its old engine protesting. The speedometer climbed, but the sense of pursuit didn't fade. The shadows seemed closer now, keeping pace just beyond the reach of her headlights. She didn't want to look directly into the rearview mirror again. Instead, her eyes flicked to the side mirrors, hoping to confirm her fears, or dismiss them entirely. But the mirrors reflected nothing. Nothing except the road, her car, and a sickening void where the steps should have been. A low vibration began to unthrow the floorboards, resonating in her bones. It wasn't the engine, she'd never felt anything like it before. The air grew heavier, thick with an almost electric charge, and a metallic tang filled her nostrils. The vibration built a pressure in her skull, like the static from the radio as seeped into her brain. She winced, clamping her hands over her ears instinctively, even though the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Her car jerked violently to the right, tires screeching as they skidded on loose gravel. Amber yanked the wheel, fighting to regain control, and the vehicle swerved back onto the asphalt. Her breathing was ragged, adrenaline coursing through her veins. That's when she saw it. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure. It wasn't a human, not entirely. It was too tall, its limbs too long and thin, like stretched shadows made solid. The teen's face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless expanse, a blank void that somehow felt more wrong than any grotesque deformity could have been. Amber screamed and slammed the brakes. The tires lagged, the car skidding to a halt mere feet from the figure. She sat frozen, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The figure didn't move. Then slowly it raised a hand. Not in a gesture of greeting, but as if reaching for her, the elongated fingers curling unnaturally. Amber threw the car into reverse, her foot slamming down on the pedal. The vehicle lurched backward, but something was wrong. The rearview mirror showed no sign of the road she'd driven on moments ago, just an empty void, endless and unbroken. The car jolted as if it had hit something, though nothing was visible. It shuddered and stalled, leaving her in silence once more. Her headlights flickered. And the figure stepped closer.
The air grew colder, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, but sinks deep into your bones, numbing you from the inside. Amber's breath clouded in front of her as she pressed her palm against the steering wheel, trying to steady her shaking hand. The vibration beneath her feet had stopped, but a new kind of tension seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The figure in front of her was closer now, though it hadn't moved. The darkness seemed to stretch and writhe around it, a presence that couldn't be ignored. Amber's pulse hammered in her chest, her throat dry and tight, as if something invisible was squeezing the life out of her. Her mind screamed at her to drive, to get away, but her body refused to cooperate. A faint sound broke the silence, whispers too quiet to make out, but too distinct to be anything other than voices. They came from every direction, swirling in the frigid air. The hairs on Amber's neck stood on end. She glanced wildly around the interior of the car, but everything was the same, empty, lifeless. Her eyes darted back to the figure, which was now standing at the edge of the headlight's reach. The air around it seemed to distort, bending like heat rising from asphalt in the summer. But it wasn't warmth. It was something far darker, something that pulled at the very fabric of reality itself. The whispers grew louder. Not words, not sentences, but broken fragments, like 1,000 voices caught in an eternal scream. Amber couldn't make out any of them, but the sensation of being watched, being hunted, grew unbearable. The figure stepped forward. Amber slammed the car into drive and stomped on the gas pedal, her foot shaking with the force of it. The engine sputtered in protest, but the car moved. It moved, slowly at first, then faster, faster, the tires screeching against the ice and gravel beneath them. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a thunderclap in her ears. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the darkness stretched infinitely, the same empty, featureless road stretching on and on, with no sign of the town or any landmarks. She wasn't getting anywhere. The whispers followed her, louder now, as if they were right next to her, in the car with her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. They knew her name. They were calling her, beckoning her to turn around, to go back. The road twisted. It wasn't the gentle curve of a winding highway. No, this was something more sinister. The road bent and buckled like it was being reshaped by unseen hands, pulling Amber in a direction she couldn't control. The trees that once lined the highway seemed to move in her peripheral vision, their dark shapes bending toward her, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. She tried to steer the wheel, but her hands wouldn't listen. It was as if the car had its own will now, as if the road itself was pulling her deeper into its grasp. The road that didn't lead anywhere. In the distance, through the thickening fog, she saw something in the middle of the road, a dark figure like a shadow standing upright and still. It was far too tall, and there was something wrong with its proportions. Amber gritted her teeth, gripped the wheel harder, and fought the wheel's sudden force. The car veered sharply toward the figure. She yanked the wheel to the right, but it was useless. The headlights flickered. She looked in the rearview mirror, unable to resist. There was no figure anymore, just the same empty, stretching road, a road that seemed to go on forever. But there, in the distance, something was following her. A blur, a dark shape that wasn't moving with the same fluidity of the shadows, but something much more sinister. It seemed to distort the air around it, warping reality itself. The whispers turned into a scream. Amber slammed on the brakes, the car skidding dangerously on the icy pavement. She spun the wheel in a frantic attempt to regain control, but the car spun out of control, fishtailing toward the edge of the road. Her breath came in ragged gasps, heart thudding violently as she struggled to keep the car on course. Then, with a bone-rattling thud, the car collided with something. Not the road, not the trees, something else. The car jerked to a halt, and for a moment, all was silent. Amber's heart thudded in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. The fog outside seemed to pulse and grow thicker, a shifting, suffocating presence that pressed against the windows. The door slammed open. She didn't have time to scream. The force of it was sudden and powerful, as if something or someone was forcing its way into the car with her. She was yanked out, the cold air biting at her skin as her feet were dragged across the frozen ground. The car was gone now, swallowed by the thickening fog. All that remained was the road, and the figure that had followed her, standing motionless in the dark. Amber's mind raced, panic clawing at her chest as she struggled to free herself. Her arms were held by cold, clammy hands, and when she looked, there was nothing there, just the heavy weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. And then, the whispers. They weren't whispers anymore. They were words, full sentences, each more impossible than the last. She couldn't understand them, but the meaning was clear. She wasn't meant to leave. Amber struggled, her feet dragging against the icy ground, as if the earth itself was trying to pull her deeper into its grasp. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding against her ribs, as she tried to break free from the invisible force that held her in place. She twisted her body, desperate to turn and run, but something unseen kept her rooted to the spot. The figure, its shape now fully revealed in the oppressive fog, was still standing there, motionless. Amber's body trembled, not from the cold, but from the suffocating dread that had settled into her bones. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it, couldn't shake the sense that whatever it was had been waiting for her all along. The whispers morphed into a cacophony of unintelligible voices, rising in volume until it was deafening, reverberating inside her skull. Each word felt like it was being driven into her mind, burrowing deeper and deeper into her consciousness. She clasped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to stop the relentless onslaught. The voices knew her, they remembered her, and they would never let her forget. Amber opened her eyes again, her vision blurred by the fog and the heavy darkness that seemed to close in on her. The figure was no longer still. It had moved, though she hadn't seen it. It was closer now, its shape looming in front of her, almost impossibly tall and thin, like a twisted reflection of a man. The eyes were the worst part. They glowed, burned, with an otherworldly light, an unholy yellow that seemed to devour everything around them. They weren't eyes as she knew them, but hollow pits, black as the void itself, and they were staring at her. Amber's throat went dry as the figure slowly extended its hand toward her, its long, spindly fingers curling in a motion that seemed both inviting and threatening. She took a step back, but the grip on her tightened, pulling her forward. She stumbled, but it didn't matter. She couldn't break free. The voices crescendoed in her mind, the words finally forming into a language she could understand. An ancient, guttural language, its meaning seeping into her consciousness like poison. "You are ours now," the voice whispered, but it was no longer one voice. It was many, all speaking in unison, layered over each other until it was impossible to tell where one began and another ended. "You cannot leave. You belong here." Amber's pulse raced as she tried to pull away again, but her feet remained frozen to the ground. She fought to scream, but her mouth felt glued shut, the air thick and suffocating. The cold had seeped into her bones, and the longer she stood there, the less she felt like herself. The world around her began to shift, twist. The road was no longer just a road. It was something else entirely, a hollow path through a dimension that wasn't meant for humans. The figure moved again, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance between them. Amber's chest tightened as a cold hand, no, not a hand, reached for her face, its fingers like claws, grazing her skin. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink. "You will stay with us," the voices hissed, and Amber's vision began to fade, her eyes growing heavy as if gravity itself had turned against her. The world dissolved into a thick, suffocating blackness. When Amber awoke, she wasn't in the place she'd been before. She wasn't even sure if she was still on Earth. She was lying on a cold, smooth surface, hard, yet oddly soft, and the air smelled of decay. She sat up slowly, her head spinning, as she tried to gather her bearings. The road, it was gone. The car, gone. The figure, gone. But the voices, they were still there. Faint at first, just whispers on the edge of her hearing, but growing louder as they surrounded her. "You're here now." Amber turned her head, looking around in panic. The space she was in wasn't like anything she'd seen before. The walls, if they could even be called walls, seemed to breathe, shifting and pulsing like some living, sentient organism. The darkness that surrounded her wasn't a solid void. It was a mass of shifting shadows, shapes too monstrous to comprehend, but somehow familiar. And then she saw them, figures humanoid in shape but with features so twisted that they didn't resemble anything human anymore. Their bodies were stretched and distorted, as if reality itself had warped around them. Some of them had eyes, though their eyes were black, empty sockets that seemed to consume all light. Others had no eyes at all. Instead, there was only darkness where their faces should have been. Amber stood, trembling, unable to speak. The voices in her head screamed louder, their words now clear. "You're never leaving." She wanted to scream. She tried to scream, but her throat was tight, suffocated by the cold that wrapped itself around her insides. She could feel the shadows drawing closer, could feel the figures circling her, waiting for something, waiting for her. Amber's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't fight back. She couldn't escape. There was no escape from this place, this nightmare, this endless loop of torment that stretched beyond time itself. And she realized, as the figures closed in on her, that she had never been meant to leave. She wasn't meant to escape. She was part of it now. They would never let her go. The darkness closed in. Amber's vision began to blur, the shifting darkness around her intensifying, pressing in from all sides. The figures, now only shadows with hollow eyes, moved with unnerving precision, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they surrounded her. She could feel their presence, each one like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She tried to step back, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. The world around her seemed to bend and fold, the floor beneath her shifting like a wave of thick, dark water. The voices grew louder, the sound growing from whispers to a deafening roar inside her head. Her thoughts began to fragment, each one slipping further away, as though they were being devoured by the encroaching darkness. A figure stepped forward from the rest. It was taller than the others, its body elongated, twisting in unnatural angles. The air around it seemed to vibrate with a low hum, like the sound of distant thunder. Amber's breath caught in her throat as the figure reached out toward her with arms that seemed to stretch, impossibly long, its fingers curling with an almost affectionate intent. "You've been chosen," the voice inside her head whispered, though it was no longer one voice but many, overlapping and blending into one grotesque chorus. Chosen to stay, chosen to become. Amber's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, but all that escaped was a strangled breath. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stumbled backward, her eyes darting around desperately. But there was nowhere to go. The figures were everywhere, and the air around her was thick with their presence. The ground shifted beneath her feet again, and suddenly, she wasn't standing in the same place. The floor had morphed into something else entirely, slick and wet, like the inside of a cave. A soft, slithering sound came from somewhere behind her. Amber turned quickly, but saw nothing, just more darkness closing in, the space stretching out infinitely in all directions. It was as though she were trapped in a cavern of perpetual night, the air growing colder and colder with every breath she took. "Don't fight it," the voice continued, its tone mockingly soft. "You cannot escape. You were never meant to. You belong to the shadows now." Amber's knees gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, feeling the cold, slick surface beneath her. The darkness around her seemed to pull and twist, like tendrils creeping toward her, and the figures closed in, their eyes glowing a faint yellow as they stared at her. They moved in synchrony, their hands outstretched toward her, ready to take her. She wanted to fight, to scream, to do anything, but her body betrayed her, frozen in place, unable to move. The pressure in her chest was overwhelming, like her lungs were being crushed under the weight of something unseen. She gasped for air, but it was as if the atmosphere itself was thickening, becoming heavier, suffocating her. And then, there it was, the feeling of something inside her mind snapping. It wasn't a physical pain, but something worse, a sense of losing herself, of unraveling. The darkness was no longer just around her. It was inside her, filling her, twisting her thoughts, taking away what remained of her consciousness. She was no longer Amber. She was nothing more than a hollow shell, a vessel for the shadows that consumed her. But she could still hear the voices. "You are ours now." As the last remnants of her sanity slipped away, she felt herself being pulled deeper into the abyss. Her body no longer belonged to her. Her mind was no longer hers to control. She was part of something bigger, something ancient, something far beyond her understanding. And it would never let her go. The last thing Amber saw before everything went dark was a pair of hollow eyes, staring at her, unblinking. She could feel them, those Amber's eyes, awareness flickered penetrating her very soul, like a dying light bulb struggling to stay alive. And then the oppressive darkness swallowed her whole. Every breath she took felt as though the air itself was being stolen from her, replaced by a suffocating coldness that invaded her lungs. She was trapped in a void, but not one of simple emptiness. This place was alive, pulsating with a force that defied comprehension. She could feel it around her, beneath her, inside her, twisting, writhing, breathing. The figures, those monstrous shapes that once stood merely as shadows, now crowded around her in the blackness, their twisted limbs brushing against her skin like the touch of something icy and decayed. Their whispers had become louder, more urgent, as if they were communicating among themselves, plotting, preparing for something dreadful. She could not understand their language, but she knew enough to feel the malice behind it. Her body was no longer hers. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think straight. All that was left was the overwhelming presence of those watching, those waiting. "You were always ours," the voice murmured again, 1,000 different tones mixing in a single breath. "From the moment you stepped onto that road, we saw you." Amber's mind was a chaotic blur, like the storm outside, the memories of her past life, of her choices, fading into nothing. She could no longer recall the name of the town, or even the exact path she'd taken. All she remembered was the road and the wrong turn, that fateful, misguided decision that had brought her here, and the otherworldly thing that had found her. It had been waiting, her body convulsed against her will, the tendrils of the shadows curling tighter around her form, wrapping her in a suffocating grip. The icy cold dug deeper into her bones, as if something unseen were siphoning away her very essence, draining her of everything she was. The more she struggled, the more it seemed to intensify. It wasn't a simple terror anymore. It was something far deeper. The terror of realizing that she had been drawn into this place not by accident, but by design. She had been marked, chosen, not just by whatever lurked in the shadows, but by the road itself, by the very fabric of this twisted dimension. Then it happened. The world around her shattered, fractured like glass breaking under immense pressure. It wasn't a loud, violent explosion. It was quiet, utterly still, yet somehow louder than anything she had ever heard. She felt herself being pulled in all directions at once. There were no longer walls or edges, just endless space that seemed to fold in on itself. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. The shadows had taken her voice. She was utterly alone, lost, drifting in an endless sea of dark. And then, a flash. At first, Amber thought she saw a figure, a silhouette against a blinding light. It was far away, barely visible, but it was there, and it was moving. A sudden surge of hope rose in her chest, a desperate belief that she could escape, that someone was out there, that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. But as the light grew brighter, she saw the figure more clearly. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, much too tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face, a face, if it could even be called that, was an abyssal emptiness. Hollow eyes stared back at her, and its mouth, if it could even be called that, stretched in a grotesque, inhuman grin. It was the thing that had been waiting for her, and it was not alone. Around the figure, more shadows coalesced, swirling like a storm of darkness. They moved in unison, gathering toward her with purpose, intent on claiming her. The air grew impossibly cold, and Amber's mind screamed out, but still, no sound escaped. She was nothing. She was no longer a person, only a presence, a soul lost in the void. The figures closed in around her, their hands, no, their claws, reaching out to her, their skin cold and decayed, their touch like ice scraping against her very soul. The last thing Amber felt was the sharp, searing pain of her essence being torn from her, her body and mind becoming one with the darkness that had ensnared her. There was no release, no salvation, only the endless, crushing weight of the shadows that consumed her. And then, everything went silent. The road remained, empty, desolate, its endless stretch still waiting for the next lost traveler to take a wrong turn.
The silence lingered thick and suffocating, like a blanket that refused to be lifted. Time had no meaning here, nor did anything else. Amber's presence, her soul, her very essence, had been swallowed whole by the abyss, yet the road outside the man, untouched by the horrors that had transpired within. The world was still, save for the occasional gust of wind that rattled the dead trees along the side of the road. It was a lonely stretch of asphalt, winding through barren land where even the night sky seemed reluctant to provide light. The stars barely shone, as if hiding their faces from the suffering below. But it wasn't empty, not entirely. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness in sharp slices of white. It rolled down the empty road, far too easily for a place so forsaken. The engine hummed, barely disturbing the stillness. The figure driving, a man named Ethan, stared out into the void beyond the reach of his headlights, as though searching for something lost, something just out of reach. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had no reason to be here. He had been traveling for days, driving through small towns, winding through country roads. This was the road that was supposed to lead him to safety, to the nearest exit to civilization. But somehow something had changed, and they had taken the wrong turn. His tears crunched over the frost-covered road, the sound hollow and eerie in the cold air. The temperature had dropped so quickly that the breath in his lungs fogged in the cabin. He wiped the condensation from his rearview mirror and glanced back at the darkness beyond his window. His knuckles were white around the steering wheel. Everything felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of pressure, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. The shadows were deeper here, darker. The road seemed longer than it should have been. Ethan checked the GPS again, but the screen was static. Blank. Unresponsive. It was as if the road itself had swallowed his signal. His car shook head forward, the engine sputtering faintly. He didn't know why he had kept driving, but some force, some pull, seemed to be guiding him further along the road. He glanced to the side, eyes scanning the thick forest that surrounded him, its trees twisted and unnatural in their formation. They seemed to lean closer to the road, as if watching him, waiting for something. A tense air trust. He shook his head, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. Just above the stretch of road, he muttered to himself, his voice thin and nervous in the stillness. "I just get out of here." Kept driving. The night felt endless. The road stretched on and on, weaving around sharp corners, winding through hills and valleys. But as Ethan pressed on, he realized the road was changing, warping. The 11 familiar markings on the asphalt faded into faded yellow lines, then disappeared entirely. The trees, which had been sparse at first, had grown thicker, more menacing. The horizon seemed to close in on him, the space around him becoming narrower and narrower. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the car didn't respond like it should have. It lurched, shuddered, and slowed. The lights dimmed, flickering as if threatening to go out. Suddenly, the car jerked to a halt. The headlights illuminated something in the distance, figures. Thin, gaunt shadows standing at the edge of the road. Their bodies were long, stretched, and distorted. They were motionless, standing in perfect stillness. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figures were still, but something about them, something felt wrong. They were too still, too silent, and they didn't look human. Their eyes, or what passed for eyes, were empty sockets, black as the void. Their mouths soon open, but no sound came from them. For a moment Ethan thought they might be statues, but the longer he stared, the more he realized they were breathing, slow, deliberate inhales that rattled in the dead silence. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, but his hands felt numb. The temperature in the car had dropped even further, and the cold see his breath misting in front of him. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, a reason for what was happening, but nothing made sense. It was as if reality itself was crumbling, pulling him into something far worse. One of the figures began to move. It was slow at first, then faster, faster still, as if the figure was learning to walk again after years of disuse. It was coming closer, its limbs bending and twisting in unnatural angles, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound. Ethan didn't think. His foot slammed on the gas pedal, and the engine roared to life, breaking the silence like a gunshot. The car surged forward, the tires screeching as they gripped the icy road, but the figures were too close. Too many. The headlights illuminated their forms fully now. There were more of them. Dozens, no hundreds, of them surrounding the car, standing in the middle of the road like a barricade, their twisted bodies forming an unbroken wall of pale, desiccated flesh. Their black eyes glistened in the light. Panic erupted inside of Ethan's chest. Swerved the car, narrowly avoiding one of the figures, but as it did, another grabbed the side mirror, the glass cracking under its grip. The car backed, swerved, and the road ahead twisted into an unnatural bend. Ethan couldn't stop now. But the figures weren't done yet. They moved faster, their limbs jerking and spasming as they neared. One reached for the door, clawing at the metal with an unholy screech, its long, skeletal fingers sliding under the cracks. The car shook violently. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened, but the road, no, the world itself, was changing. The trees distorted, bending at angles that couldn't exist. The sky began to pulse a dull, sickly orange hue flickering above. The figures were closing in. The engine sputtered. And then, for a brief second, the car stalled. The headlights went out. Ethan's heart stopped.
The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting an orange hue over the vast, open highway. Martin had driven this route countless times, yet the feeling of loneliness that crept over him each time was something he couldn't shake. The road stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of gray asphalt flanked by dense forests on either side. It was an old road, long since bypassed by the modern highways, but it was the quickest way out of the city and into the wilderness. He had always found something oddly calming about this stretch of the journey. It was quiet, too quiet at times, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the trees or the distant call of an animal. The hum of the engine and the soft glow of the dashboard lights were his only companions. The car's headlights cut through the growing dusk, the beam fading into the thickening fog that had begun to crawl along the ground. It seemed to come out of nowhere, as though the earth itself was exhaling mist. Martin adjusted the rearview mirror, noting how the last light of day clung to the horizon behind him. The road was empty, as it always was at this hour. There were no other travelers, no signs of life. The fog didn't bother him. It was part of the charm of this place. People in the city always warned him about driving here, but he had grown used to it. For him, it was just another stretch of road, albeit a bit more isolated, a bit more desolate. The air seemed to thicken as the fog grew denser. It wasn't the usual light mist that faded as quickly as it appeared. No, this fog had substance, a weight to it. It clung to the car like an invisible force, pressing against the windows as if trying to invade the cabin. Martin frowned, squinting through the windshield, trying to peer through the swirling haze. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He reached for the dial on the dashboard to adjust the headlights, but when he turned it, the lights didn't brighten. Instead, the beam grew erratic, flickering. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, slapping the dashboard. The car jerked slightly, but the headlights remained dim and unsteady, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the trees and the road ahead. He let out a frustrated sigh and glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to gauge how far the fog had spread. That's when he saw it, a flash of movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps the reflection of the fog itself. But then it came again, a figure, almost imperceptible in the haze, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Martin's heart skipped a beat, his foot instinctively lifting off the gas pedal as he slowed the car. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, in the exact center of the road, as though waiting for him to approach. He could barely make out its shape, but what he saw made no sense. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way he understood. The figure was unnaturally thin, elongated almost to the point of distortion. Its limbs seemed too long, too angular, and its silhouette flickered like a mirage. The mist surrounding it seemed to swirl, as though it was part of the fog itself. Martin's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to stop, didn't want to get closer, but his foot had frozen on the brake pedal. The car came to a halt a few feet away from the figure. The fog enveloped it completely, swallowing the figure whole. For a long moment, Martin sat motionless, his eyes locked on the place where the figure had been, waiting for it to reappear, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But there was only the hum of the engine, the fog pressing against the car like an invisible force. He reached for the door handle, his hands trembling, unsure whether to leave the car or keep driving. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to forget the shortcut and take the long way around. But his curiosity, or perhaps some deep, irrational need, drove him to step out of the car. His boots crunched softly against the road as he stepped into the thick fog, every movement feeling slower, as if the very air was pushing against him. The world around him felt heavy, like something was waiting to happen. A sudden, sharp crack echoed in the distance, like a branch snapping under the weight of something enormous. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came again, this time closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging along the ground. "Hello!" Martin called out, his voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed almost immediately by the fog. Nothing answered, but he could feel something, an oppressive presence, just beyond his reach. Something was there, and it wasn't human. The fog began to dissipate slightly, and the figure reappeared. A shadow among shadows, standing at the edge of the road. Martin's breath hitched. It hadn't moved, but now he could make out a shape that seemed to defy the natural world. It wasn't a man, nor was it an animal. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the world he knew. And as he stared at it, his mind felt as though it was being pulled in every direction, like the fog was slowly wrapping around his thoughts, suffocating them. Martin's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure remained motionless, and all he could do was stare at it, frozen in place. The fog seemed to thicken again, swirling around Martin in tight spirals, as though it was alive. Every breath he took felt colder than the last, the air thick with a strange, metallic scent. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure, the way it stood there, unmoving and silent. The sound of the dragging grew louder, unmistakable now. His heartbeat raced in time with the echoing noise. The figure didn't blink. It didn't seem to breathe. Its outline flickered in and out, as if it was unstable, as though it was tethered to some other reality. Every time the fog shifted, its shape seemed to alter slightly, distorting like a reflection on water. Martin's body felt stiff, as though every muscle was slowly being drained of its strength. His feet remained rooted to the road, the grip of some unseen force keeping him there. Another crack echoed, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he tore his eyes away from the figure. The road around him seemed to stretch longer, the darkness deeper. The fog that had once been a mere inconvenience now felt like it was suffocating him, closing in on every side. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run back to the car, but he couldn't seem to move. The growling came again, louder, unmistakably closer. It was not the sound of an animal. It was something larger, something that had no right to exist. And then, amidst the fog, he saw it: movement, the shape of a shadow moving at the edge of his vision, too quick for him to properly focus on. It was like a blur, but not. The air vibrated with a low hum, like the ground beneath him was resonating with some deep, dark force. The figure, if it could still be called that, was now joined by something else. A shape, barely discernible at first, but then it came into view with horrifying clarity. A massive, contorted body, its proportions grotesque, as though the laws of nature had bent around it. Its limbs were too long, too many, twisted in impossible angles, and its skin, if it could even be called that, was a sickly shade of gray, mottled and fleshy. It was dragging something behind it, a tangle of limbs, and the sound of bones scraping against the ground sent a jolt of terror through Martin's core. The figure in the fog seemed to smile, though the mouth was too wide, too jagged to be anything human. A laugh, No, a rasp slipped from its throat, a sound like metal grinding against metal. "Help me," it whispered, its voice both familiar and foreign, like an old friend's voice distorted beyond recognition. The air grew colder still. The fog swirled faster around him, pressing against his skin, choking him with its weight. The words seemed to echo inside his mind, reverberating in the space between his thoughts. He snapped back to reality with a gasp. The air around him was thick, suffocating. He turned back to the car, and for a brief moment he thought he saw it. A flicker of movement near the front bumper. But when he blinked, it was gone. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew he had to run. He had to make it back to the car. The growl grew louder, closer now, closer than ever. But this time there was something else. A hiss, like air escaping from a punctured tire. The ground trembled beneath his feet. And then he saw it. The fog shifted once more, and the figure, no longer a shadow, stepped fully into view. Its face, if it could be called that, was a twisted mockery of humanity. Eyes too large, mouth too wide. Its teeth gleamed in the dim light, sharp as razors. It took one slow, deliberate step toward him, and with every movement, the air seemed to grow heavier. The space around him felt wrong, distorted. "Help me," it whispered again. The same voice, the same haunting rasp. But now Martin realized it wasn't the figure that spoke. It was the fog. The ground beneath his feet trembled harder now, the road warping, bending in ways that defied logic. He turned back to the car, but it was no longer there. The vehicle had vanished, swallowed by the ever-deepening fog. The forest was now silent. Even the wind had stopped. There was no sound of animals, no distant hum of traffic. Nothing. Only the low, rasping voice of the figure, getting closer, growing louder. The fog had thickened around him to the point where it was all he could see. The road had disappeared. The trees had disappeared. Everything had disappeared, except for the figure, and the strange sound that seemed to fill his ears, like whispering. Martin's legs began to move, though he didn't remember deciding to run. His feet carried him across uneven terrain, through the fog, but it felt like the ground itself was shifting, pulling him deeper into this impossible place. He could no longer tell which direction he was heading, the fog blurring his sense of reality. Each breath was harder to take, like the air itself was choking him. Somewhere, in the distance, a laugh echoed. It wasn't the figure that laughed, though. No, the laugh came from somewhere deeper within the fog, somewhere darker, colder. It felt like the very essence of the place was alive and mocking him. Martin kept running, heart racing, legs screaming in protest. But with every step, the fog grew thicker, and he realized he couldn't escape. He was trapped. The fog closed in around Martin, thickening to the point where it felt like it was physically pressing against him, as if it were a living entity determined to swallow him whole. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision reduced to mere inches in front of him, the darkness creeping ever closer. The ground beneath him seemed to undulate, twisting and contracting with each step he took, like he was no longer running on solid earth but something far more unstable, something alien. His feet slid across the slippery road, the asphalt giving way beneath him as if the very foundation of the world had started to crumble. The sound of his frantic footsteps became muffled, drowned out by the growing hum in the air, a low, reverberating vibration that thrummed deep in his chest, rattling his bones. It was everywhere, the hum of something unseen, something that had been waiting for him to cross the threshold. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but this time, it didn't just come from one direction. Surrounded him. It was in his head, echoing within his skull, making his eyes dart frantically around. The fog was alive with memories, with ghosts, with forgotten whispers of something terrible. And as much as he tried to focus on the distant sounds of the figure's footsteps, he could no longer tell where they were coming from. They were all around him, indistinct but undeniable. His pulse quickened. He had no idea where he was anymore. The road, the trees, the sky, they were gone, swallowed by the fog, the landscape now an endless void of gray and white. The cold had seeped deep into his skin, like ice water filling his veins. He shivered uncontrollably, the numbing cold pressing in around him, stealing the warmth from his limbs. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched something solid, something warm. It was the trunk of a tree, the bark rough under his fingertips, but it didn't help him. Nothing would help him. Not the trees, not the fog, not even the desperate urge to escape. The faint crack of a twig breaking underfoot made his head snap up, but he saw nothing through the mist. Only the dense, swirling fog and the vague, shifting shapes within it. His throat tightened with panic, and his chest felt like it was closing in on itself. What was this place? Where was he? Then, without warning, the air grew still. The hum stopped, the whispers died, and then he heard something else. A rustling, soft at first, like the sound of wind through leaves. But it wasn't wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Something was moving toward him through the fog, slowly, carefully. Something with purpose. Help me. The voice was closer now, impossibly close. It was the figure. But it wasn't just the figure anymore. It was the very fog itself speaking. The voices of countless people, twisted and distorted, layered on top of each other, all pleading, all crying out. He turned his head to the side, and there it was. The shadow. The figure he had seen earlier, but now it was different. It had grown. It wasn't just one shape anymore. It had multiplied, splitting into countless forms, all interconnected by dark tendrils of something not quite solid. The shapes writhed and shifted in the mist, their outlines blurring and merging together in a grotesque dance. The creature, or creatures, moved closer to him, the tendrils of its mass undulating with every inch. Each new shape that emerged from the fog seemed to pull him deeper, forcing his attention to focus on it, as though it were drawing him into its web. The cold grew unbearable, but not in the way he was used to. It wasn't just the cold that seeped into his bones. It was the sensation of something wrong in the air, something insidious, like the world itself was twisting around him, dragging him into the dark center of something ancient and malevolent. The ground shook beneath his feet again, stronger this time, and Martin stumbled, barely catching himself. He was on the edge of losing control. His breathing became more erratic, shallow gasps as panic overtook him. He tried to run but found himself unable to move, his feet heavy, as though the fog itself had wrapped around his legs, chaining him to the ground. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking with fear. "Please, just let me go." But the figures, no, they stopped in front of him. The closest one, its face a nightmare of twisted features, leaned in close. It didn't speak. Instead, its eyes, two black voids, stared into his soul. And in that moment, Martin understood. It wasn't trying to help him. It wasn't trying to end his suffering. It wanted him to join it. The voice from before, the one that had whispered, "Help me," now felt different, more insistent, more desperate. The ground around him seemed to pulse with energy, and his vision blurred, the fog swirling into a vortex, spiraling around him as though the world itself were coming undone. The whispering voices from the fog began to merge into one unified sound. It was the sound of the place, a deep, gnawing, insistent hum that filled every inch of his mind. It was the sound of 1,000 souls trapped in this nightmare, screaming to be freed. But Martin couldn't move. He was trapped, and as the figures reached out with their elongated arms, their cold, skeletal hands brushing against his skin, he felt the coldness of death creeping into his veins. The figure's face stretched into a grotesque smile, and in that smile, he saw the horrors of every life that had come before him. The faces of those who had wandered here, those who had been consumed by the fog. A hand reached out from the darkness, and Martin felt it touch his chest, its fingers ice cold. There was no escape now. The fog, the whispers, the figures, they all converged on him, pulling him into the depths of their endless, eternal void. And with one final, tortured scream, Martin was gone. Despite the growing panic in his chest, Martin forced himself to keep moving. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around him, but he couldn't stop. The road stretched out before him like an endless tunnel. The shadows of trees lining the sides seemed to shift, as if something were dragging them. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't natural. There was something else in the air. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically, as though death itself had descended upon the pavement. Martin wrapped his arms around himself, his breath coming out in clouds, a sign of the nightmare becoming his reality. A sound in the distance, something crackling, something rough, began to grow louder. He couldn't pinpoint its origin. Was it his car, or something else? A whisper brushed his ear, low and guttural, as if it were coming from deep inside his mind. He snapped out of his thoughts as the sound of a vehicle approached, but it wasn't a car. It was the sound of something dragging itself slowly, heavily, like an animal dragging its body. Martin couldn't understand, but fear paralyzed him. He thought about turning back, but the air pressed him forward, an invisible force pushing him toward the unknown. Then suddenly he saw something on the horizon. It wasn't a car or even a human shape. It was a figure, completely dark with blurry edges, moving toward him. Its body moved in an impossible way, as if it was distorting itself. Martin froze in place. It was almost as though it was being pulled forward, yet he knew it was moving on its own, too slowly, too deliberately. The figure drew closer, its movements unnatural and jerky. Martin's heart hammered in his chest as his mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. The dark shape seemed to stretch and warp, becoming less and less human the closer it got. It had no distinct features, just a shadow, a void that devoured light, with the outline of something wrong, something that should never be. As the creature came within a few feet of him, the temperature plummeted even further. Martin could see his breath now, visible in the air, thick and misty. A strange, faint humming sound filled the silence, like something buzzing beneath the earth itself. It was too loud to ignore, but too low to identify. The figure stopped right in front of him, and for a moment, everything went still. Martin felt the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of something unseen pressing on his chest. Then it moved, slowly at first, its limbs bending and twisting in ways that made Martin's stomach churn. It reached out with one of its long, contorted arms, extending a hand toward him. He could feel its gaze, though he couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it was studying him, deciding something. A voice, deep and garbled, emanated from the thing. It sounded like a whisper mixed with static, but there was an unsettling clarity in its words. "You shouldn't have come here." Before Martin could react, the air around him seemed to compress, the pressure building up until his head felt like it was about to explode. He gasped, his breath short, his body frozen in place. The creature's hand moved closer, and in a panic, Martin forced himself to stumble backward, his legs finally betraying him and sending him crashing to the ground. The thing tilted its head, as if amused, before its body shifted violently. It split apart in an instant, becoming a swarm of dark tendrils that shot toward him like lightning. Martin tried to scream, but no sound came. His vision blurred, and the world around him warped. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the monstrous, endless void swallowing him whole. Martin's world was pitch black. The only sensation he had was an overwhelming sense of weightlessness, as if he were suspended in a vast, empty space. Time seemed irrelevant. There was no up, no down, no movement. His mind spun, disoriented, struggling to grasp any thread of logic or reality. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to wake up, to escape, but there was no escape from the cold embrace of the void. The humming sound returned, now more intense, vibrating through his body like a low, persistent growl. It was like a heartbeat, but far too deep, too primal. Then he felt it, a pressure against his chest. At first, it was subtle, but it grew stronger with each passing second, as if something was pushing against him from all sides. His ribs ached, his lungs struggled to expand, and a deep, crushing sensation began to take hold. It felt like he was being drawn into something far more dangerous than he could comprehend. Suddenly, the air shifted, and light broke through the blackness. But it was not the comforting light of day. It was an oppressive, unnatural glow, sickly and greenish, like the sickening light that comes from the depths of a swamp. The pressure on his chest released slightly, but the sensation of being watched did not. He could feel eyes, hundreds of them, staring at him from every direction. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a cold whisper filled his mind. "You are not meant to be here." The voice was 1,000 voices, all overlapping, each one more distorted than the last. It resonated deep within his soul, a gnawing presence that seemed to sink into his very thoughts. It felt ancient, as though it came from something that existed long before humanity, long before Earth itself. In that moment, Martin realized the truth. This place, this space, was not a simple void. It was something else. A prison, a trap, a place of eternal confinement. The creature, or whatever it had been, was not merely an entity. It was a gatekeeper, a watcher, ensuring that no one ever left once they entered. Martin tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. His mind raced, and in the chaotic scramble for clarity, a distant memory surfaced. Something about the curse of the road. Something his friend Dylan had mentioned. But the memory was fragmented, lost in the terror that gripped him now. A flash of light, bright and blinding, ripped through the space. The light came from nowhere and everywhere, its intensity burning into his vision. He could feel his skin searing, the heat unbearable, yet there was no way to escape it. His body screamed in agony, but there was no sound. The light expanded, and as it did, he felt himself drawn toward it, toward something else. Something that promised an end to the void. In that moment, a shape emerged from the light, an elongated figure, translucent and shimmering, with a face so twisted it defied comprehension. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body ethereal. Its eyes were dark, hollow voids, and it was staring directly at him. Martin tried to move, but his limbs were frozen in place. He wanted to run, to fight, to scream, but the creature's gaze held him captive. The figure extended one of its long, slender arms toward him, its hand opening wide, its fingers bending unnaturally, each joint cracking like dry twigs. "You should not have seen us." The words filled his mind again, their meaning sinking in deeper, twisting like a knife in his chest. The creature's arm continued to stretch forward, and Martin knew that there would be no escape. There would be no coming back. This was the end. The hand was now inches from his face, and as it touched his skin, his body froze completely. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the icy touch spreading like poison, paralyzing him. His breath stopped, his heart stopped, and his mind became nothing but static, endless, drowning static. But then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the pressure ceased. The light flickered and died. The sound of the humming stopped. The weightlessness vanished. Martin's body collapsed, lifeless, into the void. And then, as if to erase his existence from every corner of the universe, the creature whispered one last time, "We will never forget." The snow fell heavily as Michael's old, rusted truck crept through the desolate stretch of highway, barely visible through the thickening white mist. The night had settled in early, and with it, an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the world whole. The road was long, winding, and untouched by other vehicles for miles. It was the kind of place that should have felt like peace, yet there was an unshakable feeling of dread that clung to the air, heavy like the snow itself. His headlights cut through the falling snow, casting long, jagged shadows over the road ahead. Every mile he drove felt like an eternity. The isolated stretch of highway had once been part of a bustling route, but now it had fallen into neglect. The faded signs and the occasional rusted guardrail were the only remnants of a time long past. He had heard the stories, of course, the local legends of drivers who vanished without a trace, the sightings of strange figures wandering the snowbound road at night, their faces twisted in agony. But Michael didn't believe in ghosts. Not anymore. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his grip tightening on the wheel as the wind howled outside. His stomach churned with unease, but he couldn't afford to stop. He had to keep moving, had to get to the next town before the storm turned into something worse. The radio had stopped working hours ago, its static more unsettling than any song. Suddenly, the truck hit a patch of ice, and Michael's heart jumped into his throat. He fought to regain control of the wheel as the tires skidded dangerously close to the edge of the road. The truck jerked sharply to the right, but somehow he managed to right it, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He cursed under his breath, hands trembling as he slowed to a crawl. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a flash of movement in the snow. It was fleeting, a figure that seemed to appear from nowhere and then disappear into the white abyss. He slammed on the brakes, the tires crunching loudly on the frozen ground, and the truck came to a screeching halt. He stared out into the darkness, his pulse hammering in his ears. First, he saw nothing, just the endless white of the snowstorm. But then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow, unsteady, as though someone or something was walking just beyond the reach of his headlights. "Hello," Michael called out, his voice trembling in the cold, the words swallowed by the storm. No answer. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. Panic crept up his spine. He tried again. Nothing. The truck was dead. The footsteps continued, closer now. Slow, deliberate. Then, without warning, they stopped. A shiver crawled up his neck. His eyes darted around, but there was no one. No figure in the snow. Just the dark, oppressive quiet. Then, something brushed against the truck. A cold hand, as if it were the wind. But the sensation lingered, like ice settling deep into his bones. His breath caught in his throat, the cold air too sharp, too real. "Who's there?" Michael called again, his voice cracking. His body was frozen in place, every instinct telling him to drive, to leave, to get the hell out of there. But his truck wouldn't start, and the fear, it was paralyzing. He opened the door, his breath visible in the icy air. He stepped out, the crunch of his boots on the snow louder than the howling wind. The world around him seemed to close in, the snow swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. He looked down the road, but there was nothing to see except the infinite stretch of snow and darkness. And then he heard it, closer this time. A voice, barely a whisper, but enough to send his blood running cold. It was a woman's voice, low and mournful, as if she was calling from the depths of a grave. "Help me!" He spun around, searching the dark landscape. Nothing. There was no one, no sign of life. His heart raced as the voice echoed again, louder this time. The sound twisted and warped, no longer a plea, but a shrill, agonized cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror, trying to make sense of what was happening. His breath was ragged now, the cold so intense it felt like his lungs were freezing. And then, in the dim glow of the headlights, he saw her, a figure in the snow, a woman, pale as death, standing motionless at the edge of the road. Her hair was long and tangled, her clothes tattered, as though she had been wandering for years. Her face was obscured, but Michael could see her eyes, dark, hollow pits where there should have been life. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at him. He backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was frozen, not just by the cold, but by the sheer terror that gripped him. The woman began to move, slow at first, but then faster, her limbs jerking in unnatural ways. Her head snapped to the side with a sickening crack, and she began to crawl toward him on all fours, her movements erratic and disturbing. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he turned, scrambling to get back to the truck. He didn't care about the engine. He didn't care about anything except getting away from her. But as he reached the door, something grabbed his ankle. He screamed, kicking wildly, but the cold, clammy grip only tightened. He looked down, and there she was, her face now twisted in an expression of pain and rage, her mouth wide open as though to consume him whole. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice distorted, filled with anguish. But there was no help for him. There was only the icy abyss, the sound of cracking bones, and the cold death that awaited him. The last thing Michael saw before everything went black was her face. Those hollow eyes staring into his, as she dragged him into the snow, vanishing into the darkness with him. The truck remained where it was, abandoned, the snow falling heavier, blanketing the road and the final traces of Michael's terror. The storm continued its violent descent upon the lonely highway, erasing any sign of the night's terror. As the hours passed, the desolate road remained still and empty, untouched by life or death. The hours passed in silence, with only the relentless howling of the wind breaking the stillness. The storm had intensified, covering the road with fresh snow, erasing the tracks of both Michael and the woman. It was as if they had never existed. Only the oppressive cold and the endless white remained, mocking the terror that had unfolded there. At some point, the snowstorm began to let up, the wind dying down enough for the moon to pierce through the thick clouds. Its pale light illuminated the highway, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The road was empty, dead, but not for long. Around midnight, the sound of tires grinding against the icy pavement broke the silence. A pair of headlights flickered through the storm, cutting through the dark like a predator on the prowl. Another car was approaching, its tires crunching on the snow-covered road. Inside the vehicle, a man named Simon, a trucker who had been driving for hours, found himself squinting into the swirling storm. His truck was a beast, built to withstand the worst conditions, but the snow had made the road nearly impassable. He was on edge, the isolation of the highway gnawing at him. He had heard stories, whispered by others at rest stops and trucker bars, about this stretch of road. Strange things, disappearances, strange figures in the snow. He scoffed at the idea. Ghosts and monsters, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. Bunch of damn kids making up stories. But as the headlights of his truck illuminated the snow ahead, Simon felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to focus on the road, trying to keep the truck steady as the storm picked up again. But every few minutes, his eyes would flick to the side, as though expecting to see something or someone, lurking just beyond the reach of his lights. The storm grew worse, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. The eerie quiet, the unrelenting white, the feeling of being watched. It was enough to make Simon question his own sanity. The radio crackled, its static a reminder of how alone he truly was. He had stopped a few hours ago to check his truck's engine, but now he was beginning to regret that. Something didn't feel right, and then, just ahead, the figure appeared. At first, he thought it was another mirage brought on by the snowstorm, a trick of the light. But no, as he drew closer, he saw her. The woman, the same woman that Michael had seen. She stood in the middle of the road, her tattered clothes fluttering in the wind. Her hair was wild, her face still obscured, but Simon knew instinctively that she was not just some lost soul. She was something else, something wrong. He slammed his foot on the brakes, the truck skidding dangerously as he tried to stop in time. The snow made the truck almost impossible to control, and he had no choice but to steer into the ditch to avoid running her over. The vehicle came to a jolting stop, its tires spinning helplessly in the snow. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for the door handle. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice shaking as he called out into the storm. "Get out of the road!" The woman did not respond. She simply stood there, unmoving, as the truck's engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered, casting a dim glow over her as she finally turned her head to face him. Her eyes, dark as the void, locked onto his, and a chill swept through Simon's body. He could feel the air around him drop, a suffocating cold that seemed to reach into his very bones. His throat tightened, the air thickening, and for a moment, Simon thought he might suffocate right there in his seat. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but it was as if his lungs had forgotten how to work. The woman stepped forward, one foot dragging through the snow. Her movements were jerky, unnaturally slow, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by some unseen hand. Each step was accompanied by a crackling sound, as though her joints were being forced against their will. The closer she got, the colder it became. Simon's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing to make sense of the situation, but no explanation made sense. Not when she was right in front of him. Her mouth opened, not with words, but with a guttural low growl, a sound that made Simon's blood run cold. The air around her began to ripple, distorting as though the very atmosphere was being warped by her presence. And then, in one fluid motion, she lunged forward, her arms stretched out toward Simon, her face now a mask of twisted pain and hunger. The trucker barely had time to react. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, but the truck had other plans. It lurched forward, slipping and sliding, the tires spinning uselessly in the thick snow. The woman was faster than he could have ever imagined. Her cold fingers gripped the door, her strength far beyond anything human. She yanked it open with ease, and before Simon could scream, she was inside, her icy grip on his arm, pulling him out of the truck. He struggled, panic flooding his senses, but his body refused to cooperate. The cold had seeped into his very soul, paralyzing him. His vision blurred, the snowstorm now a white blur of confusion. He could feel the woman's fingers tightening around his throat, her breath icy and stale, mingling with his own. He tried to fight back, but there was no fight left in him. She dragged him into the snow, and as the world went black, Simon realized too late that there was no escape from this road. There never had been. And as the snow continued to fall, the woman disappeared into the darkness, taking Simon with her. The storm raged on, howling louder than ever, its icy fingers clawing at the earth. The white horizon stretched endlessly, swallowing the road, erasing the tracks of Simon's truck, and leaving behind nothing but an unbroken sea of snow. Time itself seemed to be lost in this endless void, and for a moment, the world was as silent as the grave. But the silence was not without its disturbances. A faint whisper reached through the gusting wind, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant voice calling from the farthest corners of the earth. It was as though the road itself was speaking, the wind carrying with it the cries of the lost, the cursed, those who had fallen to the same fate as Simon. The woman, it seemed, was not alone in her torment. For hours, the night remained still, save for the wind and the ever-present weight of the storm. But the moon hung, pale and lifeless, casting an eerie glow over the snow, illuminating the tracks that had begun to form in the untouched white. Far off, the sound of an engine roared to life. A vehicle, traveling too fast for the conditions, came barreling down the highway, its headlights cutting through the storm. The figure behind the wheel, a man named Thomas, was a traveler who had driven these roads before, though not at this hour and certainly not in such conditions. He had heard the stories, but he had long dismissed them as mere superstition, the ramblings of truckers and locals. A mind shaped by logic, Thomas thought himself above the fear that gripped so many others. As he drove through the storm, his focus was on nothing more than the road ahead. He had seen the trucker's abandoned vehicle just moments ago and had intended to stop, but something in the air told him to keep moving. His instincts, honed over years of long-haul driving, told him that stopping here would be a mistake. But as he passed, something caught his eye. At the edge of the highway, just beyond the reach of the headlights, the faint silhouette of a figure stood. It was a woman, pale, ragged, her body nearly blending with the snow around her, as if she were part of the very landscape. The faintest shudder of recognition passed through Thomas's mind, though he could not place it. He slowed the truck, considering stopping, but the strange urgency in his gut warned against it. A moment passed before the voice came. "Please, help me." It was a soft whisper, but it echoed in the air as if it had been amplified 1,000 times. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, and against his better judgment, he pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the tires grinding in the thick snow. The engine sputtered as he shifted into park and turned off the ignition. For a second, he hesitated. Something was wrong, something he couldn't put into words. But the words lingered in his mind, "Help me." With a heavy breath, Thomas opened the door, stepping into the cold, the air so crisp it stung his lungs. The storm had died down to a mere whisper, and in the quiet, the faint hum of static seemed to be all around him. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he trudged toward the figure, his eyes struggling to make out her face, hidden in the swirling darkness. "Are you okay?" he called out, his voice tentative, unsure. The woman did not answer, not at first. She only stood there, unmoving, her back to him as if she hadn't heard his words. His breath puffed out in thick clouds as he took another step closer, a strange compulsion driving him forward. When she finally turned, it was not with the slow, deliberate movement that Simon had witnessed. It was swift, too swift, and her face was no longer a human face. It was something else entirely. Her eyes were black pits, devoid of emotion or reason, and the skin around them was stretched and decayed, hanging in taut, twisted layers. The flesh was contorted, like something had peeled it back to expose the raw, bloody tissue beneath. The air around her grew colder, and Thomas's pulse raced as he tried to step back. But he was rooted to the spot, his feet as though frozen to the ground. She spoke again, but this time, the words were a rasp, a sound that made his spine twist in agony. "You shouldn't have stopped." Before Thomas could even react, her hand shot out toward him, faster than he could comprehend. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist with an unnatural strength, and his body went cold. His mind screamed to break free, to fight, but all his limbs refused to obey. The grip of the woman tightened like an iron vice, and Thomas could feel the life draining from him, as though she were feeding on his very soul. Her lips parted in a twisted grin, her teeth like jagged shards of glass. "You were warned," she whispered, her voice now thick with malice. "None leave this road." A horrible screech filled the air, a shrill, bone-chilling sound, and Thomas felt the pressure on his wrist increase. His vision blurred, the world spinning around him. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, the woman's figure now looming over him like a darkened shadow, swallowing him whole. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the woman released him. Her grip vanished, and the pressure in his chest lifted. He gasped for breath, his heart pounding, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked up, but the woman was gone, vanished into the storm, leaving no trace but the cold, the silence, and the faintest echo of her laughter, distant and mocking. Thomas, his mind unraveling, crawled back to his truck, his limbs aching with the strain. The storm was beginning to pick up again, and the sound of the wind howling through the trees was the only thing he could focus on. He had to get out of there. He had to leave. With great effort, Thomas climbed into the truck, his hands shaking as he grasped the wheel. The engine roared to life, its sound deafening against the silence of the night. But as he drove, he felt the cold presence at his back, the weight of something watching him. The woman was still out there in the snow somewhere, and Thomas knew that the road had claimed him too. As Thomas drove away, the road stretched out before him, endless and blinding in the glare of the truck's headlights. The snow was falling heavily again, a thick blanket of white that seemed to devour everything in its path. The windshield wipers struggled to clear the frozen slush, leaving streaks across his view, obscuring everything beyond the immediate glow. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart thudded in his chest, still racing from the encounter. The weight of the woman's grip lingered on his wrist, as if something unseen was still attached to him, draining him of his strength. His mind swam with confusion, trying to reconcile what he had just experienced. She can't be real. It's just the storm, he thought desperately. But the cold, the darkness, and the sinister whisper of her voice gnawed at him. The engine of the truck hummed along, its noise the only sound that seemed to keep the shadows at bay. The road was empty, and in the thick snowstorm, it felt like Thomas had entered another world, one where the rules of reality didn't seem to apply. The road, the snow, the wind, they all felt too alive, too aware. And then, through the haze of his thoughts, the truck's headlights flickered. For a moment, it was nothing more than a malfunction, a brief flash of static interference, but then it happened again. The lights dimmed, and the engine sputtered, as though something was draining its power. Thomas cursed under his breath and gripped the steering wheel tighter, willing the truck to keep moving. His vision blurred as the truck lurched, a low grinding sound coming from beneath. He swore again, his foot pressing harder on the gas, but the engine seemed to struggle more with each passing second. It was as though the truck was fighting him, as though the very road itself was fighting him. The storm outside raged harder now, the wind howling in a deafening scream. The truck lurched once more, and Thomas could feel the presence of something pressing against him, unseen but undeniable. A shiver ran down his spine as the temperature in the cab dropped sharply, his breath becoming visible in the cold air that seemed to seep through the walls. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind him was a blur, the darkness and snow closing in, but then, just for a moment, he thought he saw something. A figure, pale, motionless, standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't the woman. This figure was larger, more imposing. His eyes widened as he slammed his foot down on the brake, but the truck didn't respond. It skidded, the tires spinning helplessly on the icy surface, and before Thomas could react, the figure was right there, right in front of him. The headlights illuminated the form, and Thomas's heart stopped in his chest. The figure was a man, or something that once was. He was dressed in a tattered uniform, his face obscured by a gas mask, his eyes hollow black pits, the remnants of a human form now twisted beyond recognition. His arms were outstretched as if to stop the truck, but they were wrong. They bent at odd angles, and his fingers were elongated, tipped with claws that scraped at the hood of the truck as it passed by. The sound was horrible, like nails on a chalkboard, grating against Thomas's senses. Thomas screamed in terror, swerving the truck violently to the side. But when he looked out the window, the figure was gone. The road seemed to swallow the figure whole, as if it had never been there. But Thomas knew what he had seen. He wasn't alone. The truck's engine roared back to life, the headlights flashing on and off erratically. But the air around him grew colder, and the storm outside seemed to thicken, pulling the world closer, smothering him in a blanket of white noise. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. The snow, thick and blinding, had begun to swirl in a spiral, as though something was stirring within it, drawing him deeper into the storm. The truck's engine let out a final sputter, and then complete silence. For a moment, Thomas thought he had driven into a dead zone, a place where the storm had finally swallowed everything, and he was left alone with the madness that clawed at the edges of his mind. But when he looked outside, he saw the road still there, winding on through the storm. It stretched ahead, but now it seemed different, more sinister, more alive. The snow swirled around him, the wind howling like an animal in distress. But it wasn't the storm that Thomas feared anymore. It was the way the snow moved, as though it had purpose, as if it was not just wind and ice but something much darker, something ancient. The faint whisper reached his ears again, the voice from before. "Help me." This time it wasn't a plea. It was a command. He had no choice but to obey. His hands moved without his consent, gripping the wheel, turning it sharply, and the truck veered off the road. His heart pounded in his chest as the truck skidded uncontrollably, tires screaming against the ice and snow, as the truck began to slide toward the edge of a cliff. The wind howled louder now, filling the truck's cab with a deafening, almost unnatural sound. The snow beneath him cracked, and the truck stopped abruptly, just inches from the edge. And then he heard it, a faint guttural growl. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill the entire space around him. The wind howled again, and the snow parted, revealing a figure, a hulking mass emerging from the storm, its form outlined by the swirling flakes. Its face was a twisted mockery of human features, half-rotted, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. It was like a thing from another world, something ancient, hungry, and it was moving toward him. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The truck shuddered as the creature's shadow enveloped it, its claws scraping across the metal with a deafening screech. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. It was too late. The creature's claws dug into the side of the truck, tearing through the metal as though it were paper. Thomas screamed, but the sound was lost in the wind. There was no escaping it, no way to run. His heart raced in his chest as the truck was lifted, pulled toward the edge. And then everything went black. The storm raged on, its cold fingers reaching deep into the earth, as if claiming everything in its path. The road was quiet now, silent as the snow piled higher and higher, covering the traces of a night gone horribly wrong. The road claimed Thomas, just as it had claimed so many before him. And it would claim many more, for as long as the storm raged on.